Chapter 38 of The Law and the Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wiebke Müller. The Law and the Lady by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 38. On the Journey Back. If I had been traveling homeward in my own carriage, the remaining chapters of this narrative would never have been written. Before we had been an hour on the road, I should have called to the driver, and should have told him to turn back. Who can be always resolute? In asking that question, I speak of the women, not of the men. I had been resolute in turning a deaf ear to Mr. Playmore's doubts and cautions, resolute in holding out against my mother-in-law, resolute in taking my place by the French mail. Until 10 minutes after we had driven away from the inn my courage held out, and then it failed me. Then I said to myself, "You wretch, you've deserted your husband!" For hours afterward, if I could have stopped the mail, I would have done it. I hated the conductor, the kindest of men. I hated the Spanish ponies that drew us, the cheeriest animals that ever jingled a string of bells. I hated the bright day that would make things pleasant, and the bracing air that forced me to feel the luxury of breathing whether I liked it or not. Never was a journey more miserable than my safe and easy journey to the frontier. But one little comfort helped me to bear my heartache resignedly, a stolen morsel of Eustace's hair. We had started at an hour of the morning when he was still sound asleep. I could creep into his room, and kiss him, and cry over him softly, and cut off a stray lock of his hair, without danger of discovery. How I summoned resolution enough to leave him is, to this hour, not clear to my mind. I think my mother-in-law must have helped me, without meaning to do it. She came into the room with an erect head and a cold eye. She said, with an unmerciful emphasis on the word, "If you mean to go, Valeria, the carriage is here." Any woman with a spark of spirit in her would have meant it under those circumstances. I meant it, and did it. And then I was sorry for it. Poor humanity! Time's got all the credit of being the great consoler of afflicted mortals. In my opinion, time has been overrated in this matter. Distance does the same beneficent work far more speedily, and, when assisted by change, far more effectually as well. On the railroad to Paris, I became capable of taking a sensible view of my position. I could now remind myself that my husband's reception of me, after the first surprise and the first happiness had passed away, might not have justified his mother's confidence in him. Admitting that I ran a risk in going back to Miserrimus Dexter, should I not have been equally rash in another way if I had returned uninvited to a husband who had declared that our conjugal happiness was impossible, and that our married life was at an end? Besides, who could say that the events of the future might not yet justify me, not only to myself but to him? I might yet hear him say, "She was inquisitive when she had no business to inquire. She was obstinate when she ought to have listened to reason. She left my bedside when other women would have remained. But in the end she atoned for it all. She turned out to be right." I rested a day in Paris, and wrote 3 letters. One to Benjamin, telling him to expect me the next evening. One to Mr. Playmore, warning him in good time that I meant to take a last effort to penetrate the mystery at Gleninch. One to Eustace, of a few lines only, owning that I had helped to nurse him through the dangerous part of his illness, confessing the one reason which had prevailed with me to leave him, and entreating him to suspend his opinion of me until time had proved that I loved him more dearly than ever. This last letter I enclosed to my mother-in-law, leaving it to her discretion to choose the right time for giving it to her son. I positively forbade Mrs. Macallan, however, to tell Eustace of the new tie between us. Although he had separated himself from me, I was determined that he should not hear it from other lips than mine. Never mind why. There are certain little matters which I must keep to myself, and this is one of them. My letters being written, my duty was done. I was free to play my last card in the game, the darkly doubtful game which was neither quite for me nor quite against me as the chances now stood. End of chapter 38. Chapter 39 of The Law and the Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wiebke Müller. The Law and the Lady by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 39. On the Way to Dexter. I declare to heaven, Valeria, I believe that monster's madness is infectious, and you've caught it. This was Benjamin's opinion of me, on my safe arrival at the villa, after I had announced my intention of returning Miserrimus Dexter's visit in his company. Being determined to carry my point, I could afford to try the influence of mild persuasion. I begged my good friend to have a little patience with me. "And do remember what I have already told you," I added. "It is of serious importance to me to see Dexter again." I only heaped fuel on the fire. "See him again?" Benjamin repeated indignantly. "See him, after he grossly insulted you, under my roof, in this very room? I can't be awake, I must be asleep and dreaming." It was wrong of me, I know; but Benjamin's virtuous indignation was so very virtuous that it let the spirit of mischief loose in me. I really could not resist the temptation to outrage his sense of propriety by taking an audaciously liberal view of the whole matter. "Gently, my good friend, gently," I said. "We must make allowances for a man who suffers under Dexter's infirmities and lives Dexter's life. And really we must not let our modesty lead us beyond reasonable limits. I begin to think that I took rather a prudish view of the thing myself at the time. A woman who respects herself, and whose whole heart is with her husband, is not so very seriously injured when a wretched crippled creature is rude enough to put his arm around her waist. Virtuous indignation, if I may venture to say so, is sometimes very cheap indignation. Besides, I have forgiven him, and you must forgive him too. There is no fear of his forgetting himself again while you are with me. His house is quite a curiosity. It's sure to interest you. The pictures alone are worth the journey. I will write to him to-day, and we will go and see him together to-morrow. We owe it to ourselves, if we don't owe it to Mr. Dexter, to pay this visit. If you will look about you, Benjamin, you will see that benevolence towards everybody is the great virtue of the time we live in. Poor Mr. Dexter must have the benefit of the prevailing fashion. Come, come, march with the age, open your mind to the new ideas." Instead of accepting this polite invitation, worthy old Benjamin flew at the age we lived in like a bull at a red cloth. "Oh, the new ideas, the new ideas! By all manner of means, Valeria, let's have the new ideas. The old morality's all wrong, the old ways are all worn out. Let's march with the age we live in. Nothing comes amiss to the age we live in. The wife in England and the husband in Spain, married or not married, living together or not living together, it's all one to the new ideas. I will go with you, Valeria. I'll be worthy of the generation I live in. When we have done with Dexter, don't let's do things by halves. Let's go and get crammed with ready-made science at a lecture. Let's hear the last new professor, the man who has been behind the scenes at creation, and knows to a T how the world was made, and how long it took to make it. There's the other fellow, too. Mind we don't forget the modern Solomon, who has left his proverbs behind him, the brand-new philosopher who considers the consolation of religion in the light of harmless playthings, and who is kind enough to say that he might have been all the happier if he could only have been childish enough to play with them himself. Oh, the new ideas, the new ideas! What consoling, elevating, beautiful discoveries have been made by the new ideas! We were all monkeys before we were men, and molecules before we were monkeys. And what does it matter? And what does anything matter to anybody? I'm with you, Valeria, I'm ready. The sooner the better. Come to Dexter, come to Dexter. "I am so glad you agree with me," I said. "But let's do nothing in a hurry. 3 o'clock to-morrow will be time enough for Mr. Dexter. I will write at once, and tell him to expect us." "Where are you going?" "I am going to clear my mind of cant," said Benjamin sternly. I'm going into the library." "What are you going to read?" "I am going to read Puss in Boots, and Jack and the Beanstalk, and anything else I can find that doesn't march with the age we live in." With that parting shot at the new ideas, my old friend left me for a time. Having dispatched my note, I found myself beginning to revert, with a certain feeling of anxiety, to the subject of Miserrimus Dexter's health. How had he passed through the interval of my absence from England? Could anybody within my reach tell me news of him? To inquire of Benjamin would only be to provoke a new outbreak. While I was still considering, the housekeeper entered the room on some domestic errand. I asked, at a venture, if she had heard anything more, while I had been away, of the extraordinary person who had so seriously alarmed her on a former occasion. The housekeeper shook her head, and looked as if she thought it in bad taste to mention the subject at all. "About a week after you'd gone away, ma'am," she said, with extreme severity of manner, and with excessive carefulness in her choice of words, "the person you mention had the impudence to send a letter to you. The messenger was informed, by my master's orders, that you had gone abroad, and he and his letter were both sent about their business together. Not long afterward, ma'am, I happened, while drinking tea with Mrs. Macallan's housekeeper, to hear of the person again. He himself called in his chaise at Mrs. Macallan's to inquire about you there. How he can contrive to sit without legs to balance him is beyond my understanding, but that's neither here nor there. Legs or no legs, the housekeeper saw him, and she says, as I say, she will never forget him to her dying day. She told him, as soon as she recovered herself, of Mr. Eustace's illness, and of you and Mrs. Macallan being in foreign parts, nursing him. He went away, so the housekeeper told me, with tears in his eyes, and oaths and curses on his lips, a sight shocking to see. That's all I know about the person, ma'am, and I hope to be excused if I venture to say that the subject is, for good reasons, extremely disagreeable to me." She made a formal curtsey, and quitted the room. Left by myself, I felt more anxious and more uncertain than ever when I thought of the experiment that was to be tried on the next day. Making due allowances for exaggeration, the description of Miserrimus Dexter on his departure from Mrs. Macallan's house suggested that he had not endured my long absence very patiently, and that he was still as far as ever from giving his shattered nervous system its fair chance of repose. The next morning brought me Mr. Playmore's reply to the letter which I had addressed to him from Paris. He wrote very briefly, neither approving nor blaming my decision, but strongly reiterating his opinion that I should do well to choose a competent witness as my companion on my coming interview with Dexter. The most interesting part of the letter was at the end. "You must be prepared," Mr. Playmore wrote, "to see a change for the worse in Dexter. A friend of mine was with him on a matter of business a few days since, and was struck by the alteration in him. Your presence is sure to have its effect, one way or another. I can give you no instructions for managing him. You must be guided by the circumstances. Your own tact will tell you whether it is wise or not to encourage him to speak of the late Mrs. Eustace. The chances of his betraying himself all revolve, as I think, round that one topic. Keep him to it if you can." To this was added, in a postscript, "Ask Mr. Benjamin if you were near enough to the library door to hear Dexter tell you of his entering the bedchamber on the night of Mrs. Eustace Macallan's death." I put the question to Benjamin when we met at the luncheon-table before setting forth for the distant suburb in which Miserrimus Dexter lived. My old friend disapproved of the contemplated expedition as strongly as ever. He was unusually grave and unusually sparing of his words when he answered me. "I am no listener," he said, "but some people have voices which insist on being heard. Mr. Dexter is one of them." "Does that mean that you heard him?" I asked. "The door couldn't muffle him, and the wall couldn't muffle him," Benjamin rejoined. "I heard him, and I thought it infamous. There!" "I may want you to do more than hear him this time," I ventured to say. "I may want you to make notes of our conversation while Mr. Dexter is speaking to me. You used to write down what my father said, when he was dictating his letters to you. Have you got one of your little note-books to spare?" Benjamin looked up from his plate with an aspect of stern surprise. "It is one thing," he said, "to write under the dictation of a great merchant, conducting a vast correspondence by which thousands of pounds change hands in due course of post; and it's another thing to take down the gibberish of a maundering mad monster who ought to be kept in a cage. Your good father, Valeria, would never have asked me to do that. Forgive me, Benjamin, I must really ask you to do it. You may be of the greatest possible use to me. Come, give way this once, dear, for my sake." Benjamin looked down again at his plate, with a rueful resignation which told me that I had carried my point. "I've been tied to her apron string all my life," I heard him grumble to himself, "and it's too late in the day to get loose from her now." He looked up again at me. "I thought I had retired from business," he said, "but it seems I must turn clerk again. Well, what's the new stroke of work that's expected from me this time?" The cab was announced to be waiting for us at the gate as he asked the question. I rose and took his arm, and gave him a grateful kiss on his rosy old cheek. "Only two things," I said. "Sit down behind Mr. Dexter's chair, so that he can't see you. But take care to place yourself at the same time so that you can see me." "The less I see of Mr. Dexter, the better I shall be pleased," growled Benjamin. "What am I to do after I have taken my place behind him?" "You are to wait until I make you a sign; and when you see it, you are to begin writing down in your notebook what Mr. Dexter is saying; and you are to go on until I make another sign, which means 'leave off.'" "Well," said Benjamin, "what's the sign for 'begin'? And what's the sign for 'leave off'?" I was not quite prepared with an answer to this. I asked him to help me with a hint. No, Benjamin would take no active part in the matter. He was resigned to be employed in the capacity of passive instrument, and there all concession ended so far as he was concerned. Left to my own resources, I found it no easy matter to invent a telegraphic system which should sufficiently inform Benjamin without awakening Dexter's quick suspicion. I looked into the glass to see if I could find the necessary suggestion in anything that I wore. My earrings supplied me with the idea of which I was in search. "I shall take care to sit in an armchair," I said. "When you see me, rest my elbow on the chair, and lift my hand to my earring, as if I were playing with it. Write down what he says, and go on until suppose we say until you hear me move my chair. At that sound
Chapter number 40 of The Law and the Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wiebke Müller. The Law and the Lady by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 40. Nemesis at last. The gardener opened the gate to us on this occasion. He had evidently received his orders in anticipation of my arrival. "Mrs. Valeria?" he asked. "Yes." "And friend?" "And friend." "Please to step upstairs. You know the house." Crossing the hall, I stopped for a moment and looked at a favorite walking cane which Benjamin still kept in his hand. "Your cane will only be in your way," I said. "Had you not better leave it here?" "My cane may be useful upstairs," retorted Benjamin gruffly. "I haven't forgotten what happened in the library." It was no time to contend with him. I led the way up the stairs. Arriving at the upper flight of stairs, I was startled by hearing a sudden cry from the room above. It was like the cry of a person in pain, and it was twice repeated before we entered the circular antechamber. I was the first to approach the inner room, and to see the many-sided Miserrimus Dexter in another new aspect of his character. The unfortunate Ariel was standing before a table, with a dish of little cakes placed in front of her. Round each of her wrists was tied a string, the free ends of which, at a distance of a few yards, were held in Miserrimus Dexter's hands. "Try again, my beauty," I heard him say, as I stopped on the threshold of the door. "Take a cake." At the word of command, Ariel submissively stretched out one arm toward the dish. Just as she touched the cake with the tips of her fingers, her hand was jerked away by a pull at the string, so savagely cruel in the nimble and devilish violence of it, that I felt inclined to snatch Benjamin's cane out of his hand and break it over Miserrimus Dexter's back. Ariel suffered the pain this time in Spartan silence. The position in which she stood enabled her to be the first to see me at the door. She had discovered me. Her teeth were set, her face was flushed under the struggle to restrain herself. Not even a sigh escaped her in my presence. "Drop the string!" I called out indignantly. "Release her, Mr. Dexter, or I shall leave the house." At the sound of my voice he burst out with a shrill cry of welcome, his eyes fastened on me with a fierce devouring delight. "Come in," he cried. "See what I am reduced to in the maddening suspense of waiting for you. See how I kill the time when the time parts us. Come in, come in! I am in one of my malicious humours this morning, caused entirely, Mrs. Valeria, by my anxiety to see you. When I am in my malicious humours, I must tease something. I am teasing Ariel. Look at her! She has had nothing to eat all day, and she hasn't been quick enough to snatch a morsel of cake yet. You needn't pity her. Ariel has no nerves. I don't hurt her." "Ariel has no nerves," echoed the poor creature, frowning at me for interfering between her master and herself. "He doesn't hurt me." I heard Benjamin beginning to swing his cane behind him. "Drop the string!" I reiterated more vehemently than ever. "Drop it, or I shall instantly leave you." Miserrimus Dexter's delicate nerves shuddered at my violence. "What a glorious voice!" he exclaimed, and dropped the string. "Take the cakes," he added, addressing Ariel in his most imperial manner. She passed me, with the strings hanging from her swollen wrists, and the dish of cakes in her hand. She nodded her head at me defiantly. "Ariel has got no nerves," she repeated proudly. "He doesn't hurt me." "You see," said Miserrimus Dexter, "there is no harm done, and I dropped the strings when you told me. Don't begin by being hard on me, Mrs. Valeria, after your long absence." He paused. Benjamin, standing silent in the doorway, attracted his attention for the first time. "Who is this?" he asked, and wheeled his chair suspiciously nearer to the door. "Oh, I know!" he cried, before I could answer. "This is the benevolent gentleman who looked like the refuge of the afflicted when I saw him last. You have altered for the worse since then, sir. You have stepped into quite a new character. You personify retributive justice now. Your new protector, Mrs. Valeria, I understand." He bowed low to Benjamin with ferocious irony. "Your humble servant, Mr. Retributive Justice. I have deserved you, and I submit to you. Walk in, sir. I will take care that your new office shall be a sinecure. This lady is the light of my life. Catch me failing in respect to her if you can." He backed his chair before Benjamin, who listened to him in contemptuous silence, until he reached the part of the room in which I was standing. "Your hand, light of my life," he murmured in his gentlest tones. "Your hand, only to show that you have forgiven me." I gave him my hand. "One," he whispered entreatingly. "Only one?" He kissed my hand, once, respectfully, and dropped it with a heavy sigh. "Ah, poor Dexter!" he said, pitying himself with the whole sincerity of his egotism. "A warm heart wasted in solitude, mocked by deformity. Sad, sad! Oh, poor Dexter!" He looked round again at Benjamin, with another flash of his ferocious irony. "A beauteous day, sir," he said, with mock conversational courtesy. "Seasonable weather indeed, after the late long-continued rains. Can I offer you any refreshment? Won't you sit down? Retributive justice, when it is no taller than you are, looks best in a chair." "And a monkey looks best in a cage," rejoined Benjamin, enraged at the satirical reference to his shortness of stature. "I was waiting, sir, to see you get into your swing." The retort produced no effect on Miserrimus Dexter. It appeared to have passed by him unheard. He had changed again. He was thoughtful. He was subdued. His eyes were fixed on me with a sad and rapt attention. I took the nearest arm-chair, first casting a glance at Benjamin, which he immediately understood. He placed himself behind Dexter, at an angle which commanded a view of my chair. Ariel, silently devouring her cakes, crouched on a stool at the master's feet, and looked up at him like a faithful dog. There was an interval of quiet and repose. I was able to observe Miserrimus Dexter uninterruptedly for the first time since I had entered the room. I was not surprised. I was nothing less than alarmed by the change for the worse in him since we had last met. Mr. Playmore's letter had not prepared me for the serious deterioration in him which I could now discern. His features were pinched and worn. The whole face seemed to have wasted strangely in substance and size since I had last seen it. The softness in his eyes was gone. Blood-red veins were intertwined all over them now. They were set in a piteous and vacant stare. His once firm hands looked withered. They trembled as they lay on the coverlet. The paleness of his face, exaggerated perhaps by the black velvet jacket that he wore, had a sodden and sickly look. The fine outline was gone. The multitudinous little wrinkles at the corners of his eyes had deepened. His head sank into his shoulders when he leaned forward in his chair. Years appeared to have passed over him, instead of months, while I had been absent from England. Remembering the medical report which Mr. Playmore had given me to read, recalling the doctor's positively declared opinion that the preservation of Dexter's sanity depended on the healthy condition of his nerves, I could not but feel that I had done wisely, if I might still hope for success, in hastening my return from Spain. Knowing what I knew, fearing what I feared, I believed that his time was near. I felt, when our eyes met by accident, that I was looking at a doomed man. I pitied him. Yes, I know that compassion for him was utterly inconsistent with the motive which had taken me to his house, utterly inconsistent with the doubt still present to my mind whether Mr. Playmore had really wronged him in believing that his was the guilt which had compassed the first Mrs. Eustace's death. I felt this. I knew him to be cruel. I believed him to be false. And yet I pitied him. Is there a common fund of wickedness in us all? Is the suppression of the development of that wickedness a mere question of training and temptation? And is there something in our deeper sympathies which mutely acknowledges this when we feel for the wicked, when we crowd to a criminal trial, when we shake hands at parting, if we happen to be present officially, with the vilest monster that ever swung on a gallows? It is not for me to decide. I can only say that I pitied Miserrimus Dexter, and that he found it out. "Thank you," he said, suddenly. "You see I am ill, and you feel for me. Dear and good Valeria." "This lady's name, sir, is Mrs. Eustace Macallan," interposed Benjamin, speaking sternly behind him. "The next time you address her, remember, if you please, that you have no business with her Christian name." Benjamin's rebuke passed, like Benjamin's retort, unheeded and unheard. To all appearance, Miserrimus Dexter had completely forgotten that there was such a person in the room. "You have delighted me with the sight of you," he went on. "Add to the pleasure by letting me hear your voice. Talk to me of yourself. Tell me what you have been doing since you left England." It was necessary to my object to set the conversation afloat, and this was as good a way of doing it as any other. I told him plainly how I had been employed during my absence. "So you're still fond of Eustace?" he said bitterly. "I love him more dearly than ever." He lifted his hand and hid his face. After waiting a while, he went on, speaking in an odd, muffled manner, still under cover of his hands. "And you leave Eustace in Spain," he said. "And you return to England by yourself. What made you do that?" "What made me first come here and ask you to help me, Mr. Dexter?" He dropped his hands and looked at me. I saw in his eyes, not amazement only, but alarm. "Is it possible," he exclaimed, "that you won't let that miserable matter rest even yet? Are you still determined to penetrate the mystery at Gleninch?" "I am still determined, Mr. Dexter, and I still hope that you may be able to help me." The old distrust that I remembered so well darkened again over his face the moment I said those words. "How can I help you?" he asked. "Can I alter facts?" He stopped. His face brightened again, as if some sudden sense of relief had come to him. "I did try to help you," he went on. "I told you that Mrs. Beauly's absence was a device to screen herself from suspicion. I told you that the poison might have been given by Mrs. Beauly's maid. Has reflection convinced you? Do you see something in the idea?" This return to Mrs. Beauly gave me my first chance of leading the talk to the right topic. "I see nothing in the idea," I answered. "I see no motive. Had the maid any reason to be an enemy to the late Mrs. Eustace?" "Nobody had any reason to be an enemy to the late Mrs. Eustace," he broke out loudly and vehemently. "She was all goodness, all kindness. She never injured any human creature in thought or deed. She was a saint upon earth. Respect her memory. Let the martyr rest in her grave." He covered his face again with his hands, and shook and shuddered under the paroxysm of emotion that I had roused in him. Ariel suddenly and softly left her stool and approached me. "Do you see my 10 claws?" she whispered, holding out her hands. "Vex the master again, and you will feel my 10 claws on your throat." Benjamin rose from his seat. He had seen the action without hearing the words. I signed to him to keep his place. Ariel returned to her stool and looked up again at her master. "Don't cry," she said. "Come on. Here are the strings. Tease me again. Make me screech with the smarts of it." He never answered and never moved. Ariel bent her slow mind to meet the difficulty of attracting his attention. I saw it in her frowning brows, and her colorless eyes looking at me vacantly. On a sudden she joyfully struck the open palm of one of her hands with the fist of the other. She had triumphed. She had got an idea. "Master," she cried, "Master, you haven't told me a story for ever so long. Puzzle my thick head. Make my flesh creep. Come on. A good long story. All blood and crimes." Had she accidentally hit on the right suggestion to strike his wayward fancy? I knew his high opinion of his own skill in dramatic narrative. I knew that one of his favorite amusements was to puzzle Ariel by telling her stories that she could not understand. Would he wander away into the regions of wild romance? Or would he remember that my obstinacy still threatened him with reopening the inquiry into the tragedy at Gleninch? And would he set his cunning at work to mislead me by some new stratagem? This latter course was the course which my past experience of him suggested that he would take. But, to my surprise and alarm, I found my past experience at fault. Ariel succeeded in diverting his mind from the subject which had been in full possession of it the moment before she spoke. He showed his face again. It was overspread by a broad smile of gratified self-esteem. He was weak enough now to let even Ariel find her way to his vanity. I saw it with a sense of misgiving, with a doubt whether I had not delayed my visit until too late, which turned me cold from head to foot. Miserrimus Dexter spoke. To Ariel, not to me. "Poor devil!" he said, patting her head complacently. "You don't understand a word of my stories, do you? And yet I can make the flesh creep on your great clumsy body, and yet I can hold your muddled mind, and make you like it. Poor devil!" He leaned back serenely in his chair, and looked my way again. Would the sight of me remind him of the words that had passed between us not a minute since? No. There was the pleasantly tickled self-conceit smiling at me exactly as it had smiled at Ariel. "I excel in dramatic narrative, Mrs. Valeria," he said. And this creature here on the stool is a remarkable proof of it. She's quite a psychological study when I tell her one of my stories. It is really amusing to see the half-witted wretch's desperate efforts to understand me. You shall have a specimen. I have been out of spirits while you were away. I haven't told her a story for weeks past. I will tell her one now. Don't suppose it's an effort for me. My invention is inexhaustible. You are sure to be amused. You are naturally serious, but you are sure to be amused. I am naturally serious too, and I always laugh at her."
Ariel clapped her great shapeless hands.
"He always laughs at me," she said, with a proud look of superiority directed straight at me. I was at a loss, seriously at a loss, what to do. The outbreak which I had provoked in leading him to speak of the late Mrs. Eustace warned me to be careful, and to wait for my opportunity before I reverted to that subject. How else could I turn the conversation so as to lead him, little by little, toward the betrayal of the secrets which he was keeping from me? In this uncertainty, one thing only seemed to be plain. To let him tell his story would be simply to let him waste the precious minutes. With the vivid remembrance of Ariel's 10 claws, I decided nevertheless on discouraging Dexter's new whim at every possible opportunity, and by every means in my power. "Now, Mrs. Valeria," he began, loudly and loftily, "listen. Now, Ariel, bring your brains to a focus. I improvise poetry. I improvise fiction. We will begin with the good old formula of the fairy stories. Once upon a time—" I was waiting for my opportunity to interrupt him, when he interrupted himself. He stopped with a bewildered look. He put his hand to his head, and passed it backward and forward over his forehead. He laughed feebly. "I seem to want rousing," he said. Was his mind gone? There had been no signs of it until I had unhappily stirred his memory of the dead mistress of Gleninch. Was the weakness which I had already noticed, was the bewilderment which I now saw, attributable to the influence of a passing disturbance only? In other words, had I witnessed nothing more serious than a first warning to him and to us? Would he soon recover himself if you were patient, and gave him time? Even Benjamin was interested at last. I saw him trying to look at Dexter round the corner of the chair. Even Ariel was surprised and uneasy. She had no dark glances to cast at me now. We all waited to see what he would do, to hear what he would say next. "My harp!" he cried. "Music will rouse me." Ariel brought him his harp. "Master," she said, wonderingly, "what's come to you?" He waved his hand, commanding her to be silent. "Ode to Invention," he announced, loftily, addressing himself to me. "Poetry and music improvised by Dexter. Silence! Attention!" His fingers wandered feebly over the harp strings, awakening no melody, suggesting no words. In a little while his hand dropped. His head sank forward gently, and rested on the frame of the harp. I started to my feet, and approached him. Was it a sleep, or was it a swoon? I touched his arm, and called to him by his name. Ariel instantly stepped between us, with a threatening look at me. At the same moment Miserrimus Dexter raised his head. My voice had reached him. He looked at me with a curious contemplative quietness in his eyes which I had never seen in them before. "Take away the harp," he said to Ariel, speaking in languid tones, like a man who was very weary. The mischievous, half-witted creature, in sheer stupidity or in downright malice, I am not sure which, irritated him once more. "Why, master?" she asked, staring at him with the harp hugged in her arms. "What's come to you? Where's the story?" "We don't want the story," I interposed. "I have many things to say to Mr. Dexter which I have not said yet." Ariel lifted her heavy hand. "You will have it," she said, and advanced toward me. At the same moment the master's voice stopped her. "Put away the harp, you fool!" he repeated sternly, "and wait for the story until I choose to tell it." She took the harp submissively back to its place at the end of the room. Miserrimus Dexter moved his chair a little closer to mine. "I know what will rouse me," he said, confidentially. "Exercise will do. I've had no exercise lately. Wait a little, and you will see." He put his hands on the machinery of the chair, and started on his customary course down the room. Here again the ominous change in him showed itself under a new form. The pace at which he travelled was not the furious pace that I remembered. The chair no longer rushed under him on rumbling and whistling wheels. It went, but it went slowly. Up the room and down the room he painfully urged it, and then he stopped for want of breath. We followed him. Ariel was first, and Benjamin was by my side. He motioned impatiently to both of them to stand back, and to let me approach him alone. "I'm out of practice," he said, faintly. "I hadn't the heart to make the wheels roar and the floor tremble, while you were away." Who would not have pitied him? Who would have remembered his misdeeds at that moment? Even Ariel felt it. I heard her beginning to whine and whimper behind me. The magician who alone could rouse the dormant sensibilities in her nature had awakened them now by his neglect. Her fatal cry was heard again, in mournful, moaning tones. "What's come to you, master? Where's the story?" "Never mind her," I whispered to him. "You want the fresh air. Send for the gardener. Let's take a drive in your pony chaise." It was useless. Ariel would be noticed. The mournful cry came once more. "Where's the story? Where's the story?" The sinking spirit leaped up in Dexter again. "You wretch! You fiend!" he cried, whirling his chair around and facing her. "The story is coming. I can tell it. I will tell it. You whimpering idiot, get me the wine. Why didn't I think of it before? The kingly Burgundy. That's what I want, Valeria, to set my invention alight and flaming in my head. Glasses for everybody. Honor to the king of vintages, the royal Clos Vougeot." Ariel opened the cupboard in the alcove, and produced the wine and the high Venetian glasses. Dexter drained his goblet full of Burgundy at a draught. He forced us to drink, or at least to pretend to drink, with him. Even Ariel had her share this time, and emptied her glass in rivalry with her master. The powerful wine mounted almost instantly to her weak head. She began to sing hoarsely a song of her own devising, in imitation of Dexter. It was nothing but the repetition, the endless mechanical repetition, of her demand for the story. "Tell us the story, master! Master, tell us the story!" Absorbed over his wine, the master silently filled his goblet for the second time. Benjamin whispered to me, while his eye was off us, "Take my advice, Valeria, for once. Let us go." "One last effort," I whispered back. "Only one." Ariel went drowsily on with her song. "Tell us the story, master! Master, tell us the story!" Miserrimus Dexter looked up from his glass. The generous stimulant was beginning to do its work. I saw the color rising in his face. I saw the bright intelligence flashing again in his eyes. The Burgundy had roused him. The good wine stood my friend, and offered me a last chance. "No story," I said. "I want to talk to you, Mr. Dexter. I am not in the humour for a story." "Not in the humour?" he repeated, with a gleam of the old impish irony showing itself again in his face. "That's an excuse. I see what it is. You think my invention is gone, and you are not frank enough to confess it. I'll show you you're wrong. I'll show you that Dexter is himself again. Silence you, Ariel, or you shall leave the room. I've got it, Mrs. Valeria. All laid out here, with scenes and characters complete." He touched his forehead, and looked at me with a furtive and smiling cunning before he added his next words. "It's the very thing to interest you, my fair friend. It's the story of a mistress and a maid. Come back to the fire and hear it." The story of a mistress and a maid. If that meant anything, it meant the story of Mrs. Beauly and her maid, told in disguise. The title, and the look which had escaped him when he announced it, revived the hope that was well nigh dead in me. He had rallied at last. He was again in possession of his natural foresight and his natural cunning. Under pretence of telling Ariel her story, he was evidently about to make the attempt to mislead me for the second time. The conclusion was irresistible. To use his own words, Dexter was himself again. I took Benjamin's arm as we followed him back to the fireplace in the middle of the room. "There is a chance for me yet," I whispered. "Don't forget the signals." We returned to the places which we had already occupied. Ariel cast another threatening look at me. She had just sense enough left, after emptying her goblet of wine, to be on the watch for a new interruption on my part. I took care, of course, that nothing of the sort should happen. I was now as eager as Ariel to hear the story. The subject was full of snares for the narrator. At any moment, in the excitement of speaking, Dexter's memory of the true events might show itself reflected in the circumstances of the fiction. At any moment he might betray himself. He looked around him and began. "My public, are you seated? My public, are you ready?" he asked gaily. "Your face a little more this way," he added, in his softest and tenderest tones, motioning me to turn my full face toward him. "Surely I am not asking too much? You look at the meanest creature that crawls. Look at me. Let me find my inspiration in your eyes. Let me feed my hungry admiration on your form. Come, have one little pitying smile left for the man whose happiness you have wrecked. Thank you, light of my life, thank you." He kissed his hand to me, and threw himself back luxuriously in his chair. "The story," he resumed, "the story at last. In what form shall I cast it? In the dramatic form, the oldest way, the truest way, the shortest way of telling a story. Title first. A short title. A taking title. Mistress and Maid. Scene: the land of romance, Italy. Time: the age of romance, the 15th century. Ha! Look at Ariel. She knows no more about the 15th century than the cat in the kitchen, and yet she is interested already. Happy Ariel! Ariel looked at me again, in the double intoxication of the wine and the triumph. "I know no more than the cat in the kitchen," she repeated, with a broad grin of gratified vanity. "I am happy, Ariel. What are you?" Miserrimus Dexter laughed uproariously. "Didn't I tell you?" he said. "Isn't she fun? Persons of the drama," he resumed, "3 in number, women only. Angelica, a noble lady, noble alike in spirit and in birth. Cunegonda, a beautiful devil in woman's form. Damoride, her unfortunate maid. First scene: a dark vaulted chamber in a castle. Time, evening. The owls are hooting in the wood. The frogs are croaking in the marsh. Look at Ariel, her flesh creeps. She shudders audibly. Admirable Ariel!" My rival in the master's favor eyed me defiantly. "Admirable Ariel!" she repeated, in drowsy accents. Miserrimus Dexter paused to take up his goblet of Burgundy, placed close at hand on a little sliding table attached to his chair. I watched him narrowly as he sipped the wine. The flush was still mounting in his face. The light was still brightening in his eyes. He set down his glass again with a jovial smack of his lips, and went on. "Persons present in the vaulted chamber: Cunegonda and Damoride. Cunegonda speaks. Damoride. Madame. Who lies ill in the chamber above us? Madame, the noble Lady Angelica. A pause. Cunegonda speaks again. Damoride. Madame. How does Angelica like you? Madame, the noble lady, sweet and good to all who approach her, is sweet and good to me. Have you attended on her, Damoride? "Sometimes, madam, when the nurse was weary." "Has she taken her healing medicine from your hand?" "Once or twice, madam, when I happened to be by." "Damoride, take this key and open the casket on the table here." Damoride obeys. "Do you see a green vial in the casket?" "I see it, madam." "Take it out." Damoride obeys. "Do you see a liquid in the green vial? Can you guess what it is?" "No, madam." "Shall I tell you?" Damoride bows respectfully. "Poison is in the vial." Damoride starts. She shrinks from the poison. She would fain put it aside. Her mistress signs to her to keep it in her hand. Her mistress speaks. "Damoride, I have told you one of my secrets. Shall I tell you another?" Damoride waits, fearing what is to come. Her mistress speaks. "I hate the Lady Angelica. Her life stands between me and the joy of my heart. You hold her life in your hand." Damoride drops on her knees. She is a devout person. She crosses herself, and then she speaks. "Mistress, you terrify me. Mistress, what do I hear?" Cunegonda advances, stands over her, looks down on her with terrible eyes, whispers the next words. "Damoride, the Lady Angelica must die, and I must not be suspected. The Lady Angelica must die, and by your hand." He paused again, to sip the wine once more, no, to drink a deep draught of it this time. Was the stimulant beginning to fail him already? I looked at him attentively as he laid himself back again in his chair to consider for a moment before he went on. The flush on his face was as deep as ever, but the brightness in his eyes was beginning to fade already. I had noticed that he spoke more and more slowly as he advanced to the later dialogue of the scene. Was he feeling the effort of invention already? Had the time come when the wine had done all that the wine could do for him? We waited. Ariel sat watching him with vacantly staring eyes and vacantly open mouth. Benjamin, impenetrably expecting the signal, kept his open note-book on his knee, covered by his hand. Miserrimus Dexter went on. Damoride hears those terrible words. Damoride clasps her hands in entreaty. "Oh, madame, madame, how can I kill the dear and noble lady? What motive have I for harming her?" Cunegonda answers. "You have the motive of obeying me." Damoride falls with her face on the floor at her mistress's feet. "Madame, I cannot do it. Madame, I dare not do it." Cunegonda answers, "You run no risk. I have my plan for diverting discovery from myself, and my plan for diverting discovery from you." Damoride repeats, "I cannot do it. I dare not do it." Cunegonda's eyes flash lightnings of rage. She takes from its place of concealment in her bosom— He stopped in the middle of the sentence, and put his hand to his head, not like a man in pain, but like a man who had lost his idea. Would it be well if I tried to help him to recover his idea? Or would it be wiser if I could only do it to keep silence? I could see the drift of his story plainly enough. His object, under the thin disguise of the Italian romance, was to meet my unanswerable objection to suspecting Mrs. Beauly's maid, the objection that the woman had no motive for committing herself to an act of murder. If he could practically contradict this by discovering a motive which I should be obliged to admit, his end would be gained. Those inquiries which I had pledged myself to pursue, those inquiries which might, at any moment, take a turn that directly concerned him, would, in that case, be successfully diverted from the right to the wrong person. The innocent maid would set my strictest scrutiny at defiance, and Dexter would be safely shielded behind her. I determined to give him time. Not a word passed my lips. The minutes followed each other. I waited in the deepest anxiety. It was a trying and a critical moment. If he succeeded in inventing a probable motive, and in shaping it neatly to suit the purpose of his story, he would prove, by that act alone, that there were reserves of mental power still left in him which the practised eye of the Scotch doctor had failed to see. But the question was, would he do it? He did it. Not in a new way, not in a convincing way, not without a painfully evident effort. Still, well done or ill done, he found a motive for the maid. "Cunegonda," he resumed, "takes from its place of concealment in her bosom a written paper, and unfolds it. 'Look at this,' she says. Damoride looks at the paper, and sinks again at her mistress's feet in a paroxysm of horror and despair. Cunegonda is in possession of a shameful secret in the maid's past life. Cunegonda can say to her, 'Choose your alternative. Either submit to an exposure which disgraces you, and disgraces your parents forever, or make up your mind to obey me.' Damoride might submit to the disgrace if it only affected herself. But her parents are honest people. She cannot disgrace her parents. She is driven to her last refuge. There is no hope of melting the hard heart of Cunegonda. Her only resource is to raise difficulties. She tries to show that there are obstacles between her and the crime. 'Madame, madame,' she cries, 'how can I do it, when the nurse is there to see me?' Cunegonda answers, 'Sometimes the nurse sleeps. Sometimes the nurse is away.' Damoride still persists. 'Madame, madame, the door is kept locked, and the nurse has got the key.' The key! I instantly thought of the missing key at Gleninch. Had he thought of it too? He certainly checked himself as the word escaped him. I resolved to make the signal. I rested my elbow on the arm of my chair, and played with my earring. Benjamin took out his pencil and arranged his note-book so that Ariel could not see what he was about if she happened to look his way. We waited until it pleased Miserrimus Dexter to proceed. The interval was a long one. His hand went up again to his forehead. A duller and duller look was palpably stealing over his eyes. When he did speak, it was not to go on with the narrative, but to put a question. "Where did I leave off?" he asked. My hopes sank again as rapidly as they had risen. I managed to answer him, however, without showing any change in my manner. "You left off," I said, "where Damoride was speaking to Cunegonda." "Yes, yes," he interposed. "And what did she say?" "She said the door is kept locked, and the nurse has got the key." He instantly leaned forward in his chair. "No," he answered, vehemently. "You're wrong. Key! Nonsense! I never said key." "I thought you did, Mr. Dexter." "I never did. I said something else, and you have forgotten it." I refrained from disputing with him, in fear of what might follow. We waited again. Benjamin, sullenly submitting to my caprices, had taken down the questions and answers that had passed between Dexter and myself. He still mechanically kept his page open, and still held his pencil in readiness to go on. Ariel, quietly submitting to the drowsy influence of the wine while Dexter's voice was in her ears, felt uneasily the change to silence. She glanced round her restlessly. She lifted her eyes to the Master. There he sat, silent, with his hand to his head, still struggling to marshal his wandering thoughts, still trying to see light through the darkness that was closing round him. "Master," cried Ariel, piteously, "what's become of the story?" He started as if she had wakened him out of his sleep. He shook his head impatiently, as though he wanted to throw off some oppression that weighed upon it. "Patience, patience," he said. "The story is going on again." He dashed at it desperately. He picked up the first lost thread that fell in his way, reckless whether it were the right thread or the wrong one. "Damoride fell on her knees. She burst into tears. She said—" He stopped and looked about him with vacant eyes. "What name did I give the other woman?" he asked, not putting the question to me, or to either of my companions, asking it of himself, and asking it of the empty air. "You called the other woman Cunegonda," I said. At the sound of my voice his eyes turned slowly, turned on me, and yet failed to look at me. Dull and absent, still and changeless, they were eyes that seemed to be fixed on something far away. Even his voice was altered when he spoke next. It had dropped to a quiet, vacant, monotonous tone. I had heard something like it while I was watching by my husband's bedside, at the time of his delirium, when Eustace's mind appeared to be too weary to follow his speech. Was the end so near as this? "I called her Cunegonda," he repeated, "and I called the other—" He stopped once more. "And you called the other Damoride," I said. Ariel looked up at him with a broad stare of bewilderment. She pulled impatiently at the sleeve of his jacket to attract his attention. "Is this the story, master?" she asked. He answered without looking at her, his changeless eyes still fixed, as it seemed, on something far away. "This is the story," he said absently. "But why Cunegonda? Why Damoride? Why not mistress and maid? It's easier to remember mistress and maid." He hesitated. He shivered as he tried to raise himself in his chair. Then he seemed to rally. "What did the maid say to the mistress?" he muttered. What? He hesitated again. Then something seemed to dawn upon him unexpectedly. Was it some new thought that had struck him? Or some lost thought that he had recovered? Impossible to say. He went on, suddenly and rapidly went on, in these strange words. "The letter, the maid said. The letter! Oh, my heart, every word a dagger in my heart! Oh, you letter! Horrible, horrible, horrible letter!" What in God's name was he talking about? What did those words mean? Was he unconsciously pursuing his faint and fragmentary recollections of a past time at Gleninch, under the delusion that he was going on with the story? In the wreck of the other faculties, was memory the last to sink? Was the truth, the dreadful truth, glimmering on me dimly through the awful shadows cast before it by the advancing eclipse of the brain? My breath failed me, a nameless horror crept through my whole being. Benjamin, with his pencil in his hand, cast one warning look at me. Ariel was quiet and satisfied. "Go on, master," was all she said. I like it. Go on with the story." He went on, like a man sleeping with his eyes open, and talking in his sleep. "The maid said to the mistress, no. The mistress said to the maid. The mistress said, 'Show him the letter. Must do it.' The maid said, 'No, mustn't do it. Shan't show it. Stuff. Nonsense. Let him suffer. What can get him off? Show it? No. Let the worst come to the worst. Show it then. The mistress said—'" He paused, and waved his hand rapidly to and fro before his eyes, as if he were brushing away some visionary confusion or entanglement. "Which was it last?" he said. "Mistress or maid? Mistress. No. Maid speaks, of course. Loud, positive. You scoundrels, keep away from that table. The diary's there. Number 9, Caldershaws. Ask for Dandy. You shan't have the diary. A secret in your ear. The diary will hang him. I won't have him hanged. How dare you touch my chair? My chair's me. How dare you touch me?" The last words burst on me like a gleam of light. I had read them in the report of the trial, in the evidence of the sheriff's officer. Miserrimus Dexter had spoken in those very terms when he had tried vainly to prevent the men from seizing my husband's papers, and when the men had pushed his chair out of the room. There was no doubt now of what his memory was busy with. The mystery at Gleninch. His last backward flight of thought circled feebly and more feebly, nearer and nearer to the mystery at Gleninch. Ariel aroused him again. She had no mercy on him. She insisted on hearing the whole story. "Why do you stop, master? Get along with it. Tell us quick. What did the missus say to the maid?" He laughed feebly and tried to imitate her. "What did the missus say to the maid?" he repeated. His laugh died away. He went on speaking more and more vacantly, more and more rapidly. "The mistress said to the maid, 'We've got him off. What about the letter? Burn it now. No fire in the grate. No matches in the box. House topsy-turvy. Servants all gone. Tear it up. Shake it up in the basket, along with the rest. Shake it up. Waste paper. Throw it away. Gone for ever. Oh, Sarah, Sarah, Sarah! Gone for ever!'" Ariel clapped her hands, and mimicked him in her turn. "Oh, Sarah, Sarah, Sarah!" she repeated. "Gone for ever! That's prime, master! Tell us, who was Sarah?" His lips moved, but his voice sank so low that I could barely hear him. He began again with the old melancholy refrain. "The maid said to the mistress, no, the mistress said to the maid—" He stopped abruptly, and raised himself erect in the chair. He threw up both his hands above his head, and burst into a frightful screaming laugh. "Funny! Why don't you laugh? Funny, 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 funny! He fell back in the chair. The shrill and dreadful laugh died away into a low sob. Then there was one long, deep, wearily drawn breath. Then nothing but a mute, vacant face, turned up to the ceiling, with eyes that looked blindly, with lips parted in a senseless, changeless grin. Nemesis at last! The foretold doom had fallen on him. The night had come. But one feeling animated me when the first shock was over. Even the horror of that fearful sight seemed only to increase the pity that I felt for the stricken wretch. I started impulsively to my feet. Seeing nothing, thinking of nothing but the helpless figure in the chair, I sprang forward to raise him, to revive him, to recall him, if such a thing might still be possible, to himself. At the first step that I took, I felt hands on me. I was violently drawn back. "Are you blind?" cried Benjamin, dragging me nearer and nearer to the door. "Look there!" He pointed, and I looked. Ariel had been beforehand with me. She had raised her master in the chair. She had got one arm around him. In her free hand she brandished an Indian club, torn from a trophy of Oriental weapons that ornamented the wall over the fireplace. The creature was transfigured. Her dull eyes glared like the eyes of a wild animal. She gnashed her teeth in the frenzy that possessed her. "You have done this!" she shouted to me, waving the club furiously around and around over her head. "Come near him, and I'll dash your brains out. I'll smash you till there's not a whole bone left in your skin." Benjamin, still holding me with one hand, opened the door with the other. I let him do with me as he would. Ariel fascinated me. I could look at nothing but Ariel. Her frenzy vanished as she saw us retreating. She dropped the club. She threw both arms around him, and nestled her head on his bosom, and sobbed and wept over him. "Master, master, they shan't vex you any more. Look up again. Laugh at me as you used to do. Say, Ariel, you're a fool. Be like yourself again." I was forced into the next room. I heard a long, low, wailing cry of misery from the poor creature who loved him with a dog's fidelity and a woman's devotion. The heavy door was closed between us. I was in the quiet antechamber, crying over that piteous sight, clinging to my kind of old friend, as helpless and as useless as a child. Benjamin turned the key in the lock. "There's no use in crying about it," he said quietly. "It would be more to the purpose, Valeria, if you thanked God that you have got out of that room safe and sound. Come with me." He took the key out of the lock, and led me downstairs into the hall. After a little consideration, he opened the front door of the house. The gardener was still quietly at work in the grounds. "Your master is taken ill," Benjamin said, "and the woman who attends upon him has lost her head, if she ever had a head to lose. Where does the nearest doctor live?" The man's devotion to Dexter showed itself as a woman's devotion had shown itself, in the man's rough way. He threw down his spade with an oath. "The master taken bad," he said. "I'll fetch the doctor. I shall find him sooner than you will." "Tell the doctor to bring a man with him," Benjamin added. "He may want help." The gardener turned around sternly. "I'm the man," he said. "Nobody shall help but me." He left us. I sat down on one of the chairs in the hall, and did my best to compose myself. Benjamin walked to and fro, deep in thought. "Both of them fond of him," I heard my old friend say to himself. "Half monkey, half man, and both of them fond of him. That beats me." The gardener returned with the doctor, a quiet, dark, resolute man. Benjamin advanced to meet them. "I have got the key," he said. "Shall I go upstairs with you?" Without answering, the doctor drew Benjamin aside into a corner of the hall. The two talked together in low voices. At the end of it the doctor said, "Give me the key. You can be of no use. You will only irritate her." With those words he beckoned to the gardener. He was about to lead the way up the stairs when I ventured to stop him. "May I stay in the hall, sir?" I said. "I am very anxious to hear how it ends." He looked at me for a moment before he replied. "You had better go home, madam," he said. "Is the gardener acquainted with your address?" "Yes, sir." "Very well. I will let you know how it ends by means of the gardener. Take my advice. Go home." Benjamin placed my arm in his. I looked back and saw the doctor and the gardener ascending the stairs together on their way to the locked-up room. "Never mind the doctor," I whispered. "Let's wait in the garden." Benjamin would not hear of deceiving the doctor. "I mean to take you home," he said. I looked at him in amazement. My old friend, who was all meekness and submission so long as there was no emergency to try him, now showed the dormant reserve of manly spirit and decision in his nature as he had never, in my experience, shown it yet. He led me into the garden. We had kept our cab. It was waiting for us at the gate. On our way home Benjamin produced his notebook. "What's to be done, my dear, with the gibberish that I have written here?" he said. "Have you written it all down?" I asked, in surprise. "When I undertake a duty, I do it," he answered. "You never gave me the signal to leave off. You never moved your chair. I have written every word of it. What shall I do? Throw it out the cab window?" "Give it to me." "What are you going to do with it?" "I don't know yet. I will ask Mr. Playmore."
Chapter number 41 of The Law and the Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wiebke Müller. The Law and the Lady by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 41. Mr. Playmore in a New Character. By that night's post, although I was far from being fit to make the exertion, I wrote to Mr. Playmore to tell him what had taken place, and to beg for his earliest assistance and advice. The notes in Benjamin's book were partly written in shorthand, and were, on that account, of no use to me in their existing condition. At my request, he made 2 fair copies. One of the copies I enclosed in my letter to Mr. Playmore. The other I laid by me, on my bedside table, when I went to rest. Over and over again, through the long hours of the wakeful night, I read and re-read the last words which had dropped from Miserrimus Dexter's lips. Was it possible to interpret them to any useful purpose? At the very outset they seemed to set interpretation at defiance. After trying vainly to solve the hopeless problem, I did at last what I might as well have done at first. I threw down the paper in despair. Where were my bright visions of discovery and success now? Scattered to the winds. Was there the faintest chance of the stricken man's return to reason? I remembered too well what I had seen to hope for it. The closing lines of the medical report which I had read in Mr. Playmore's office recurred to my memory in the stillness of the night. When the catastrophe has happened, his friends can entertain no hope of his cure. The balance once lost will be lost for life." The confirmation of that terrible sentence was not long in reaching me. On the next morning the gardener brought a note, containing the information which the doctor had promised to give me on the previous day. Miserrimus Dexter and Ariel were still where Benjamin and I had left them together, in the long room. They were watched by skilled attendants, waiting the decision of Dexter's nearest relative, a younger brother who lived in the country, and who had been communicated with by telegraph. It had been found impossible to part the faithful Ariel from her master without using the bodily restraints adopted in cases of raging insanity. The doctor and the gardener, both unusually strong men, had failed to hold the poor creature when they first attempted to remove her on entering the room. Directly they permitted her to return to her master, the frenzy vanished. She was perfectly quiet and contented so long as they let her sit at his feet and look at him. Sad as this was, the report of Miserrimus Dexter's condition was more melancholy still. "My patient is in a state of absolute imbecility." Those were the words in the doctor's letter, and the gardener's simple narrative confirmed them as the truest words that could have been used. He was utterly unconscious of poor Ariel's devotion to him. He did not even appear to know that she was present in the room. For hours together he remained in a state of utter lethargy in his chair. He showed an animal interest in his meals, and a greedy animal enjoyment of eating and drinking as much as he could get, and that was all. "This morning," the honest gardener said to me at parting, "we thought he seemed to wake up a bit. Looked about him, you know, and made queer signs with his hands. I couldn't make out what he meant, no more could the doctor. She knew, poor thing, she did. Went and got him his harp, and put his hand up to it. Lord bless you, no use. He couldn't play no more than I can. Twanged at it anyhow, and grinned and gabbled to himself. No, he'll never come right again. Any person can see that, without the doctor to help him. Enjoys his meals, as I told you, and that's all. It would be the best thing that could happen if it would please God to take him. There's no more to be said. I wish you good morning, ma'am." He went away with the tears in his eyes, and he left me, I own it, with the tears in mine. An hour later there came some news which revived me. I received a telegram from Mr. Playmore, expressed in these welcome words: "Obliged to go to London by to-night's mail train. Expect me to breakfast to-morrow morning." The appearance of the lawyer at our breakfast table duly followed the appearance of his telegram. His first words cheered me up. To my infinite surprise and relief, he was far from sharing the despondent view which I took of my position. "I don't deny," he said, "that there are some serious obstacles in your way, but I should never have called here before attending to my professional business in London if Mr. Benjamin's notes had not produced a very strong impression on my mind. For the first time, as I think, you really have a prospect of success. For the first time, I feel justified in offering, under certain restrictions, to help you. That miserable wretch, in the collapse of his intelligence, has done what he would never have done in the possession of his sense and his cunning. He has let us see the first precious glimmerings of the light of truth." "Are you sure it is the truth?" I asked. "In two important particulars," he answered, "I know it to be the truth. Your idea about him is the right one. His memory, as you suppose, was the least injured of his faculties, and was the last to give way under the strain of trying to tell that story. I believe his memory to have been speaking to you, unconsciously to himself, in all that he said from the moment when the first reference to the letter escaped him to the end." "But what does the reference to the letter mean?" I asked. "For my part, I am entirely in the dark about it." "So am I," he answered frankly. "The chief one amongst the obstacles which I mentioned just now is the obstacle presented by that same letter. The late Mrs. Eustace must have been connected with it in some way, or Dexter would never have spoken of it as a dagger in his heart. Dexter would never have coupled her name with the words which describe the tearing up of the letter and the throwing of it away. I can arrive with some certainty at this result, and I can get no further. I have no more idea than you have of who wrote the letter, or of what was written in it. If we are ever to make that discovery, probably the most important discovery of all, we must dispatch our first inquiries a distance of 3,000 miles. In plain English, my dear lady, we must send to America." This, naturally enough, took me completely by surprise. I waited eagerly to hear why we were to send to America. "It rests with you," he proceeded, "when you hear what I have to tell you, to say whether you will go to the expense of sending a man to New York or not. I can find the right man for the purpose, and I estimate the expense, including a telegram—" "Never mind the expense," I interposed, losing all patience with the eminently Scotch view of the case, which put my purse in the first place of importance. "I don't care for the expense. I want to know what you have discovered." He smiled. "She doesn't care for the expense," he said to himself pleasantly. "How like a woman!" I might have retorted, "He thinks of the expense before he thinks of anything else. How like a Scotchman!" As it was, I was too anxious to be witty. I only drummed impatiently with my fingers on the table, and said, "Tell me! Tell me!" He took out the fair copy from Benjamin's note-book which I had sent to him, and showed me these among Dexter's closing words. "What about the letter? Burn it now. No fire in the grate. No matches in the box. House topsy-turvy. Servants all gone." "Do you really understand what those words mean?" I asked. "I look back into my own experience," he answered, "and I understand perfectly what the words mean." "And can you make me understand them too?" "Easily. In those incomprehensible sentences, Dexter's memory has correctly recalled certain facts. I have only to tell you the facts, and you will be as wise as I am. At the time of the trial, your husband surprised and distressed me by insisting on the instant dismissal of all the household servants at Gleninch. I was instructed to pay them a quarter's wages in advance, to give them the excellent written characters which their good conduct thoroughly deserved, and to see the house clear of them at an hour's notice. Eustace's motive for this summary proceeding was much the same motive which animated his conduct toward you. 'If I am ever to return to Gleninch,' he said, 'I cannot face my honest servants after the infamy of having stood my trial for murder.' There was his reason. Nothing that I could say to him, poor fellow, shook his resolution. I dismissed the servants accordingly. At an hour's notice they quitted the house, leaving their work for the day all undone. The only persons placed in charge of Gleninch were persons who lived on the outskirts of the park, that is to say, the lodge-keeper and his wife and daughter. On the last day of the trial I instructed the daughter to do her best to make the rooms tidy. She was a good girl enough, but she had no experience as a housemaid. It would never enter her head to lay the bedroom fires ready for lighting, or to replenish the empty match-boxes. Those chance words that dropped from Dexter would, no doubt, exactly describe the state of his room when he returned to Gleninch with the prisoner and his mother from Edinburgh. That he tore up the mysterious letter in his bedroom, and, finding no means immediately at hand for burning it, that he threw the fragment into the empty grate or into the waste-paper basket, seems to be the most reasonable conclusion that we can draw from what we know. In any case, he would not have much time to think about it. Everything was done in a hurry on that day. Eustace and his mother, accompanied by Dexter, left for England the same evening by the night train. I myself locked up the house, and gave the keys to the lodge-keeper. It was understood that he was to look after the preservation of the reception-rooms on the ground floor, and that his wife and daughter were to perform the same service between them in the rooms upstairs. On receiving your letter, I drove at once to Gleninch to question the old woman on the subject of the bedrooms, and of Dexter's room especially. She remembered the time when the house was shut up, by associating it with the time when she was confined to her bed by an attack of sciatica. She had not crossed the lodge door, she was sure, for at least a week, if not longer, after Gleninch had been left in charge of her husband and herself. Whatever was done in the way of keeping the bedrooms aired and tidy during her illness was done by her daughter. She, and she only, must have disposed of any letter which might have been lying about in Dexter's room. Not a vestige of torn paper, as I can myself certify, is to be discovered in any part of the room now. Where did the girl find the fragments of the letter, and what did she do with them? Those are the questions, if you approve of it, which we must send 3,000 miles away to ask, for this sufficient reason, that the lodge-keeper's daughter was married more than a year since, and that she is settled with her husband in business at New York. It rests with you to decide what is to be done. Don't let me mislead you with false hopes. Don't let me tempt you to throw away your money. Even if this woman does remember what she did with the torn paper, the chances, at this distance of time, are enormously against our ever recovering a single morsel of it. Be in no haste to decide. I have my work to do in the city. I can give you the whole day to think it over." "Send the men to New York by the next steamer," I said. "There is my decision, Mr. Playmore, without keeping you waiting for it." He shook his head in grave disapproval of my impetuosity. In my former interview with him we had never once touched on the question of money. I was now, for the first time, to make acquaintance with Mr. Playmore on the purely Scotch side of his character. "Why, you don't even know what it will cost you!" he exclaimed, taking out his pocket-book with the air of a man who was equally startled and scandalized. "Wait till I tot it up," he said, "in English and American money." "I can't wait. I want to make more discoveries." He took no notice of my interruption. He went on impenetrably with his calculations. "The man will go second class, and will take a return ticket. Very well, his ticket includes his food, and, being, thank God, a teetotaler, he won't waste your money in buying liquor on board. Arrived at New York, he will go to a cheap German house, where he will, as I am credibly informed, be boarded and lodged at the rate—" By this time, my patience being completely worn out, I had taken my cheque-book from the table-drawer, had signed my name, and had handed the blank cheque across the table to my legal adviser. "Fill it in with whatever the man wants," I said, "and for heaven's sake let's get back to Dexter." Mr. Playmore fell back in his chair and lifted his hands and eyes to the ceiling. I was not in the least impressed by that solemn appeal to the unseen powers of arithmetic and money. I insisted positively on being fed with more information. "Listen to this," I went on, reading from Benjamin's notes. "What did Dexter mean when he said, 'Number 9, Caldershaws. Ask for Dandy'? You shan't have the diary. A secret in your ear. The diary will hang him. How came Dexter to know what was in my husband's diary? And what does he mean by number 9, Caldershaws, and the rest of it? Facts again?" "Facts again," Mr. Playmore answered. "Muddled up together, as you may say, but positive facts for all that. Caldershaws, you must know, is one of the most disreputable districts in Edinburgh. One of my clerks, whom I am in the habit of employing confidentially, volunteered to inquire for Dandy at number 9. It was a ticklish business in every way, and my man wisely took a person with him who was known in the neighbourhood. Number 9 turned out to be, ostensibly, a shop for the sale of rags and old iron, and Dandy was suspected of trading now and then additionally as a receiver of stolen goods. Thanks to the influence of his companion, backed by a bank-note, which can be repaid, by the way, out of the fund for the American expenses, my clerk succeeded in making the fellow speak. Not to trouble you with needless details, the result in substance was this. A fortnight or more before the date of Mrs. Eustace's death, Dandy made 2 keys from wax models supplied to him by a new customer. The mystery observed in the matter by the agent who managed it excited Dandy's distrust. He had the man privately watched before he delivered the keys, and he ended in discovering that his customer was Miserrimus Dexter. Wait a little, I have not done yet. Add to this information Dexter's incomprehensible knowledge of the contents of your husband's diary, and the product is, that the wax models sent to the old iron shop in Caldershaws were models taken by theft from the key of the diary and the key of the table-drawer in which it was kept. I have my own idea of the revelations that are still to come, if this matter is properly followed up. Never mind going into that at present. Dexter, I tell you again, is answerable for the late Mrs. Eustace's death. How he is answerable, I believe you are in a fair way of finding out. And more than that, I say now what I could not venture to say before. It is a duty toward justice, as well as a duty toward your husband, to bring the truth to light. As for the difficulties to be encountered, I don't think they need daunt you. The greatest difficulties give way in the end, when they are attacked by the united alliance of patient resolution and economy." With a strong emphasis on the last words, my worthy adviser, mindful of the flight of time and the claims of business, rose to take his leave. "One word more," I said, as he held out his hand. "Can you manage to see Miserrimus Dexter before you go back to Edinburgh? From what the gardener told me, his brother must be with him by this time. It would be a relief to me to hear the latest news of him, and to hear it from you." "It is part of my business in London to see him," said Mr. Playmore. "But mind, I have no hope of his recovery. I only wish to satisfy myself that his brother is able and willing to take care of him. So far as we are concerned, Mrs. Eustace, this unhappy man has said his last words." He opened the door, stopped, considered, and came back to me. "With regard to that matter of sending the agent to America," he resumed, "I propose to have the honour of submitting to you a brief abstract—" "Oh, Mr. Playmore!" "A brief abstract in writing, Mrs. Eustace, of the estimated expenses of the whole proceeding. You will be good enough maturely to consider the same, making any remarks on it, tending to economy, which may suggest themselves to your mind at the time. And you will further oblige me, if you approve of the abstract, by yourself filling in the blank space on your cheque with the needful amount in words and figures. No, madam, I really cannot justify it to my conscience to carry about my person any such loose and reckless document as a blank cheque. There's a total disregard for the first claims of prudence and economy implied in this small slip of paper, which is nothing less than a flat contradiction of the principles that have governed my whole life. I can't submit to flat contradiction. Good morning, Mrs. Eustace. Good morning." He laid my cheque on the table with a low bow, and left me. Among the curious developments of human stupidity which occasionally present themselves to view, surely the least excusable is the stupidity
Chapter 42 of The Law and the Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wiebke Müller. The Law and the Lady by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 42. More Surprises. The same evening I received my abstract by the hands of a clerk. It was an intensely characteristic document. My expenses were remorselessly calculated downward to shillings, and even to pence; and our unfortunate messenger's instructions in respect to his expenditure were reduced to a nicety which must have made his life in America nothing less than a burden to him. In mercy to the man, I took the liberty, when I wrote back to Mr. Playmore, of slightly increasing the indicated amount of the figures which were to appear on the cheque. I ought to have better known the correspondent whom I had to deal with. Mr. Playmore's reply, informing me that our emissary had started on his voyage, returned a receipt in due form, and the whole of the surplus money to the last farthing. A few hurried lines accompanied the abstract, and stated the result of the lawyer's visit to Miserrimus Dexter. There was no change for the better. There was no change at all. Mr. Dexter, the brother, had arrived at the house accompanied by a medical man accustomed to the charge of the insane. The new doctor declined to give any definite opinion on the case until he had studied it carefully with plenty of time at his disposal. It had been accordingly arranged that he should remove Miserrimus Dexter to the asylum of which he was the proprietor, as soon as the preparations for receiving the patient could be completed.
The one difficulty that still remained to be met related to the disposal of the faithful creature who had never left her master night or day since the catastrophe had happened. Ariel had no friends and no money. The proprietor of the asylum could not be expected to receive her without the customary payment, and Mr. Dexter's brother regretted to say that he was not rich enough to find the money. A forcible separation from the one human being whom she loved, and a removal in the character of a pauper to a public asylum, such was the prospect which awaited the unfortunate creature, unless some one interfered in her favour before the end of the week. Under these sad circumstances, good Mr. Playmore, passing over the claims of economy in favour of the claims of humanity, suggested that we should privately start a subscription, and offered to head the list liberally himself. I must have written all these pages to very little purpose, if it is necessary for me to add that I instantly sent a letter to Mr. Dexter, the brother, undertaking to be answerable for whatever money was to be required while the subscriptions were being collected, and only stipulating that when Miserrimus Dexter was removed to the asylum, Ariel should accompany him. This was readily conceded. But serious objections were raised when I further requested that she might be permitted to attend on her master in the asylum as she had attended on him in the house. The rules of the establishment forbade it, and the universal practice in such cases forbade it, and so on and so on. However, by dint of perseverance and persuasion, I so far carried my point as to gain a reasonable concession. During certain hours in the day, and under certain wise restrictions, Ariel was to be allowed the privilege of waiting on her master in his room, as well as of accompanying him when he was brought out in his chair to take the air in the garden. For the honour of humanity, let me add that the liability which I had undertaken made no very serious demands on my resources. Placed in Benjamin's charge, our subscription list prospered. Friends, and even strangers sometimes, opened their hearts and their purses when they heard Ariel's melancholy story. The day which followed the day of Mr. Playmore's visit brought me news from Spain, in a letter from my mother-in-law. To describe what I felt when I broke the seal and read the first lines is simply impossible. Let Mrs. Macallan be heard on this occasion in my place. Thus she wrote. Prepare yourself, my dearest Valeria, for a delightful surprise. Eustace has justified my confidence in him. When he returns to England, he returns, if you will let him, to his wife. This resolution, let me hasten to assure you, has not been brought about by any persuasions of mine. It is the natural outgrowth of your husband's gratitude and your husband's love. The first words he said to me, when he was able to speak, were these: "If I live to return to England, and if I go to Valeria, do you think she will forgive me?" We can only leave it to you, my dear, to give the answer. If you love us, answer us by return of post. Having now told you what he said when I first informed him that you had been his nurse, and remember, if it seems very little, that he is still too weak to speak except with difficulty, I shall purposely keep my letter back for a few days. My object is to give him time to think, and to frankly tell you of it if the interval produces any change in his resolution. 3 days have passed, and there is no change. He has but one feeling now. He longs for the day which is to unite him again to his wife. But there is something else connected with Eustace that you ought to know, and that I ought to tell you. Greatly as time and suffering have altered him in many respects, there is no change, Valeria, in the aversion, the horror I may even say, with which he views your idea of inquiring anew into the circumstances which attended the lamentable death of his first wife. It makes no difference to him that you are only animated by a desire to serve his interests. Has she given up that idea? Are you positively sure she has given up that idea? Over and over again he has put these questions to me. I have answered. What else could I do in the miserable feeble state in which he still lies? I have answered in such a manner as to soothe and satisfy him. I have said, relieve your mind of all anxiety on that subject. Valeria has no choice but to give up the idea. The obstacles in her way have proven to be insurmountable. The obstacles have conquered her. This, if you remember, was what I really believed would happen when you and I spoke of that painful topic, and I have heard nothing from you since which has tended to shake my opinion in the smallest degree. If I am right, as I pray God I may be, in the view that I take, you have only to confirm me in your reply, and all will be well. In the other event, that is to say, if you are still determined to persevere in your hopeless project, then make up your mind to face the result. Set Eustace's prejudices at defiance in this particular, and you lose your hold on his gratitude, his penitence, and his love. You will, in my belief, never see him again. I express myself strongly, in your own interests, my dear, and for your own sake. When you reply, write a few lines to Eustace, enclosed in your letter to me. As for the date of our departure, it is still impossible for me to give you any definite information. Eustace recovers very slowly, the doctor has not yet allowed him to leave his bed, and when we do travel, we must journey by easy stages. It will be at least 6 weeks, at the earliest, before we can hope to be back again in dear old England. Affectionately yours, Catherine Macallan. I laid down the letter, and did my best, vainly enough for some time, to compose my spirits. To understand the position in which I now found myself, it is only necessary to remember one circumstance. The messenger to whom we had committed our inquiries was at that moment crossing the Atlantic on his way to New York. What was to be done? I hesitated. Shocking as it may seem to some people, I hesitated. There was really no need to hurry my decision. I had the whole day before me. I went out and took a wretched, lonely walk, and turned the matter over in my mind. I came home again, and turned the matter over once more by the fireside. To offend and repel my darling when he was returning to me, penitently returning of his own free will, was what no woman in my position, and feeling as I did, could under any earthly circumstances have brought herself to do. And yet, on the other hand, how in heaven's name could I give up my grand enterprise at the very time when even wise and prudent Mr. Playmore saw such a prospect of succeeding in it that he had actually volunteered to help me? Placed between those two cruel alternatives, which could I choose? Think of your own frailties, and have some mercy on mine. I turned my back on both the alternatives. Those two agreeable fiends, prevarication and deceit, took me, as it were, softly by the hand. "Don't commit yourself either way, my dear," they said, in their most persuasive manner. "Write just enough to compose your mother-in-law, and to satisfy your husband. You've got time before you. Wait and see if time doesn't stand your friend, and get you out of the difficulty." Infamous advice! And yet I took it, I who had been well brought up, and who ought to have known better. You who read the shameful confession would have known better, I am sure. You are not included in the prayer-book category among the miserable sinners. Well, well, let me have virtue enough to tell the truth. In writing to my mother-in-law, I informed her that it had been found necessary to remove Miserrimus Dexter to an asylum, and I left her to draw her own conclusions from that fact, unenlightened by so much as one word of additional information. In the same way, I told my husband a part of the truth, and no more. I said I forgave him with all my heart, and I did. I said he had only to come to me, and I would receive him with open arms, and so I would. As for the rest, let me say with Hamlet, "The rest is silence." Having dispatched my unworthy letters, I found myself growing restless, and feeling the want of a change. It would be necessary to wait at least 8 or 9 days before we could hope to hear by telegraph from New York. I bade farewell for a time to my dear and admirable Benjamin, and betook myself to my old home in the north, at the vicarage of my uncle Starkweather. My journey to Spain to nurse Eustace had made my peace with my worthy relatives. We had exchanged friendly letters, and I had promised to be their guest as soon as it was possible for me to leave London. I passed a quiet and, all things considered, a happy time among the old scenes. I visited once more the bank by the river side where Eustace and I had first met. I walked again on the lawn, and loitered through the shrubbery, those favourite haunts in which we had so often talked over our troubles, and so often forgotten them in a kiss. How sadly and strangely had our lives been parted since that time! How uncertain still was the fortune which the future had in store for us! The associations amid which I was now living had their softening effect on my heart, their elevating influence over my mind. I reproached myself, bitterly reproached myself, for not having written more fully and frankly to Eustace. Why had I hesitated to sacrifice to him my hopes and my interests in the coming investigation? He had not hesitated, poor fellow. His first thought was the thought of his wife. I had passed a fortnight with my uncle and aunt before I heard again from Mr. Playmore. When a letter from him arrived at last, it disappointed me indescribably. A telegram from our messenger informed us that the lodge-keeper's daughter and her husband had left New York, and that he was still in search of a trace of them. There was nothing to be done but to wait as patiently as we could, on the chance of hearing better news. I remained in the north, by Mr. Playmore's advice, so as to be within an easy journey of Edinburgh, in case it might be necessary for me to consult him personally. 3 more weeks of weary expectation passed before a second letter reached me. This time it was impossible to say whether the news were good or bad. It might have been either. It was simply bewildering. Even Mr. Playmore himself was taken by surprise. These were the last wonderful words, limited of course by considerations of economy, which reached us by telegram. Chapter number 43 of The Law and the Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wiebke Müller. The Law and the Lady by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 43. At last. My letter from Mr. Playmore, enclosing the agent's extraordinary telegram, was not inspired by the sanguine view of our prospects which he had expressed to me when we met at Benjamin's house. "If the telegram means anything," he wrote, "it means that the fragments of the torn letter have been cast into the housemaid's bucket, along with the dust, the ashes, and the rest of the litter in the room, and have been emptied on the dust-heap at Gleninch. Since this was done, the accumulated refuse collected from the periodical cleansings of the house, during a term of nearly 3 years, including, of course, the ashes from the fires kept burning, for the greater part of the year, in the library and the picture gallery, have been poured upon the heap, and have buried the precious morsels of paper deeper and deeper, day by day. Even if we have a fair chance of finding these fragments, what hope can we feel, at this distance of time, of recovering them with the writing in a state of preservation? I shall be glad to hear, by return of post if possible, how the matter strikes you. If you could make it convenient to consult with me personally in Edinburgh, we should save time, when time may be of serious importance to us. While you are at Dr. Starkweather's, you are within easy reach of the place. Please think of it." I thought of it seriously enough. The foremost question which I had to consider was the question of my husband. The departure of the mother and son from Spain had been so long delayed by the surgeon's orders, that the travellers had only advanced on their homeward journey as far as Bordeaux, when I had last heard from Mrs. Macallan 3 or 4 days since. Allowing for an interval of repose at Bordeaux, and for the slow rate at which they would be compelled to move afterward, I might still expect them to arrive in England some time before a letter from the agent in America could reach Mr. Playmore. How, in this position of affairs, I could contrive to join the lawyer in Edinburgh, after meeting my husband in London, it was not easy to see. The wise and the right way, as I thought, was to tell Mr. Playmore frankly that I was not mistress of my own movements, and that he had better address his next letter to me at Benjamin's house. Writing to my legal adviser in this sense, I had a word of my own to add on the subject of the torn letter. In the last years of my father's life I had travelled with him in Italy, and I had seen in the museum at Naples the wonderful relics of a bygone time discovered among the ruins of Pompeii. By way of encouraging Mr. Playmore, I now reminded him that the eruption which had overwhelmed the town had preserved, for more than 1600 years, such perishable things as the straw in which pottery had been packed, the paintings on house walls, the dresses worn by the inhabitants, and, most noticeable of all in our case, a piece of ancient paper still attached to the volcanic ashes which had fallen over it. If these discoveries had been made after a lapse of 16 centuries, under a layer of dust and ashes on a large scale, surely we might hope to meet with similar cases of preservation, after a lapse of 3 or 4 years only, under a layer of dust and ashes on a small scale. Taking for granted, what was perhaps doubtful enough, that the fragments of the letter could be recovered, my own conviction was that the writing on them, though it might be faded, would certainly still be legible. The very accumulations which Mr. Playmore deplored would be the means of preserving them from the rain and the damp. With these modest hints I closed my letter, and thus for once, thanks to my Continental experience, I was able to instruct my lawyer. Another day passed, and I heard nothing of the travellers. I began to feel anxious. I made my preparations for my journey southward overnight, and I resolved to start for London the next day, unless I heard of some change in Mrs. Macallan's travelling arrangements in the interval. The post of the next morning decided my course of action. It brought me a letter from my mother-in-law, which added one more to the memorable dates in my domestic calendar. Eustace and his mother had advanced as far as Paris on their homeward journey, when a cruel disaster had befallen them. The fatigues of travelling, and the excitement of his anticipated meeting with me, had proved together to be too much for my husband. He had held out as far as Paris with the greatest difficulty, and he was now confined to his bed again, struck down by a relapse. The doctors, this time, had no fear for his life, provided that his patience would support him through a lengthened period of the most absolute repose. "It now rests with you, Valeria," Mrs. Macallan wrote, "to fortify and comfort Eustace under this new calamity. Do not suppose that he has ever blamed or thought of blaming you for leaving him with me in Spain, as soon as he was declared to be out of danger. It was I who left her, he said to me, when we first talked about it, and it is my wife's right to expect that I should go back to her. Those were his words, my dear, and he has done all he can to abide by them. Helpless in his bed, he now asks you to take the will for the deed, and to join him in Paris. I think I know you well enough, my child, to be sure that you will do this, and I need only add one word of caution before I close my letter. Avoid all reference, not only to the trial you will do that of your own accord but even to our house at Gleninch. You will understand how he feels, in his present state of nervous depression, when I tell you that I should never have ventured on asking you to join him here, if your letter had not informed me that your visits to Dexter were at an end. Would you believe it? His horror of anything which recalls our past troubles is still so vivid, that he has actually asked me to give my consent to selling Gleninch." So Eustace's mother wrote of him; but she had not trusted entirely to her own powers of persuasion. A slip of paper was enclosed in her letter, containing these 2 lines, traced in pencil, oh, so feebly and so wearily, by my poor darling himself: "I am too weak to travel any further, Valeria. Will you come to me and forgive me?" A few pencil marks followed, but they were illegible. The writing of those 2 short sentences had exhausted him. It's not saying much for myself, I know; but having confessed it when I was wrong, let me at least record it when I did what was right. I decided instantly on giving up all further connection with the recovery of the torn letter. If Eustace asked me the question, I was resolved to be able to answer truly, "I have made the sacrifice that assures your tranquillity. When resignation was hardest, I have humbled my obstinate spirit, and I have given way for my husband's sake." There was half an hour to spare before I left the vicarage for the railway station. In that interval I wrote again to Mr. Playmore, telling him plainly what my position was, and withdrawing, at once and for ever, from all Chapter number 44 of The Law and the Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wiebke Müller. The Law and the Lady by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 44. Our New Honeymoon. It is not to be disguised or denied that my spirits were depressed on my journey to London. To resign the one cherished purpose of my life, when I had suffered so much in pursuing it, and when I had to all appearance so nearly reached the realization of my hopes, was putting to a hard trial a woman's fortitude and a woman's sense of duty. Still, even if the opportunity had been offered to me, I would not have recalled my letter to Mr. Playmore. It is done and well done, I said to myself, and I have only to wait a day to be reconciled to it, when I give my husband my first kiss. I had planned and hoped to reach London in time to start for Paris by the night mail, but the train was twice delayed on the long journey from the north, and there was no help for it but to sleep at Benjamin's villa, and to defer my departure until the morning. It was of course impossible for me to warn my old friend of the change in my plans. My arrival took him by surprise. I found him alone in his library, with a wonderful illumination of lamps and candles, absorbed over some morsels of torn paper scattered on the table before him. "What in the world are you about?" I asked. Benjamin blushed. I was going to say like a young girl, but young girls have given up blushing in these latter days of the age we live in. "Oh, nothing, nothing," he said confusedly. "Don't notice it." He stretched out his hand to brush the morsels of paper off the table. Those morsels raised a sudden suspicion in my mind. I stopped him. "You have heard from Mr. Playmore," I said. "Tell me the truth, Benjamin. Yes or no?" Benjamin blushed a shade deeper, and answered, "Yes." "Where is the letter?" "I mustn't show it to you, Valeria." This, need I say, made me determined to see the letter. My best way of persuading Benjamin to show it to me was to tell him of the sacrifice that I had made to my husband's wishes. "I have no further voice in the matter," I added, when I had done. "It now rests entirely with Mr. Playmore to go on, to give up, and this is my last opportunity of discovering what he really thinks about it. Don't I deserve some little indulgence? Have I no claim to look at the letter?" Benjamin was too much surprised and too much pleased with me, when he heard what had happened, to be able to resist my entreaties. He gave me the letter. Mr. Playmore wrote to appeal confidentially to Benjamin, as a commercial man. In the long course of his occupation in business, it was just possible that he might have heard of cases in which documents have been put together again, after having been torn up by design or by accident. Even if his experience failed in this particular, he might be able to refer to some authority in London who would be capable of giving an opinion on the subject. By way of explaining his strange request, Mr. Playmore reverted to the notes which Benjamin had taken at Miserrimus Dexter's house, and informed him of the serious importance of the gibberish which he had reported under protest. The letter closed by recommending that any correspondence which ensued should be kept a secret from me, on the ground that it might excite false hopes in my mind if I were informed of it. I now understood the tone which my worthy adviser had adopted in writing to me. His interest in the recovery of the letter was evidently so overpowering that common prudence compelled him to conceal it from me in case of ultimate failure. This did not look as if Mr. Playmore was likely to give up the investigation on my withdrawal from it. I glanced again at the fragments of paper on Benjamin's table, with an interest in them which I had not felt yet. "Has anything been found at Gleninch?" I asked. "No," said Benjamin. "I have only been trying experiments with a letter of my own before I wrote to Mr. Playmore." "Oh, you have torn up the letter yourself, then?" "Yes, and to make it all the more difficult to put them together again, I shook up the pieces in a basket. It's a childish thing to do, my dear, at my age." He stopped, looking very much ashamed of himself. "Well," I went on, "and have you succeeded in putting your letter together again?" "It's not very easy, Valeria, but I have made a beginning. It's the same principle as the principle in the puzzles which we used to put together when I was a boy. Only get one central bit of it right, and the rest of the puzzle falls into its place in a longer or a shorter time.
Please don't tell anybody, my dear. People might say I was in my dotage. To think of that gibberish in my notebook having a meaning in it, after all! I only got Mr. Playmore's letter this morning, and I'm really almost ashamed to mention it. I have been trying experiments of torn letters, off and on, ever since. You won't tell upon me, will you?" I answered the dear old man by a hearty embrace. Now that he had lost his steady moral balance, and had caught the infection of my enthusiasm, I loved him better than ever. But I was not quite happy, though I tried to appear so. Struggle against it as I might, I felt a little mortified when I remembered that I had resigned all further connection with the search for the letter at such a time as this. My one comfort was to think of Eustace. My one encouragement was to keep my mind fixed as constantly as possible on the bright change for the better that now appeared in the domestic prospect. Here, at least, there was no disaster to fear. Here I could honestly feel that I had triumphed. My husband had come back to me of his own free will. He had not given way under the hard weight of evidence. He had yielded to the nobler influences of his gratitude and his love. And I had taken him to my heart again, not because I had made discoveries which left him no other alternative than to live with me, but because I believed in the better mind that had come to him, and loved and trusted him without reserve. Was it not worth some sacrifice to have arrived at this result? True, most true. And yet I was a little out of spirits. Ah, well, well, the remedy was within a day's journey. The sooner I was with Eustace, the better. Early the next morning I left London for Paris by the tidal train. Benjamin accompanied me to the terminus. "I shall write to Edinburgh by to-day's post," he said, in the interval before the train moved out of the station. "I think I can find the man Mr. Playmore wants to help him, if he decides to go on. Have you any message to send, Valeria?" "No, I have done with it, Benjamin. I have nothing more to say." "Shall I write and tell you how it ends, if Mr. Playmore does really try the experiment at Gleninch?" I answered as I felt, a little bitterly. "Yes," I said. "Write and tell me if the experiments fail." My old friend smiled. He knew me better than I knew myself. "All right," he said resignedly. "I have got the address of your banker's correspondent in Paris. You will have to go there for money, my dear, and you may find a letter waiting for you in the office when you least expect it. Let me hear how your husband goes on. Good-bye, and God bless you." That evening I was restored to Eustace. He was too weak, poor fellow, even to raise his head from the pillow. I knelt down at the bedside and kissed him. His languid, weary eyes kindled with a new life as my lips touched his. "I must try to live now," he whispered, "for your sake." My mother-in-law had delicately left us together. When he said those words, the temptation to tell him of the new hope that had come to brighten our lives was more than I could resist. "You must try to live now, Eustace," I said, "for someone else besides me." His eyes looked wonderingly into mine. "Do you mean my mother?" he asked. I laid my head on his bosom, and whispered back, "I mean your child." I had all my reward for all that I had given up. I forgot Mr. Playmore. I forgot Gleninch. Our new honeymoon dates in my remembrance from that day. The quiet time passed, in the by-street in which we lived. The outer stir and tumult of Parisian life ran its daily course around us, unnoticed and unheard. Steadily, though slowly, Eustace gained strength. The doctors, with a word or two of caution, left him almost entirely to me. "You are his physician," they said. "The happier you make him, the sooner he will recover." The quiet, monotonous round of my new life was far from wearying me. I, too, wanted repose. I had no interests, no pleasures, out of my husband's room. Once, and only once, the placid surface of our lives was just gently ruffled by an allusion to the past. Something that I accidentally said reminded Eustace of our last interview at Major Fitz David's house. He referred very delicately to what I had then said of the verdict pronounced on him at the trial, and he left me to infer that a word from my lips, confirming what his mother had already told him, would quiet his mind at once and forever.
My answer involved no embarrassment or difficulties. I could and did honestly tell him that I had made his wishes my law. But it was hardly in womanhood, I am afraid, to be satisfied with merely replying and to leave it there. I thought it due to me that Eustace too should concede something, in the way of an assurance which might quiet my mind. As usual with me, the words followed the impulse to speak them. "Eustace," I asked, "are you quite cured of those cruel doubts which once made you leave me?" His answer, as he afterwards said, made me blush with pleasure. "Ah, Valeria, I should never have gone away if I had known you then as well as I know you now." So the last shadows of distrust melted away out of our lives. The very remembrance of the turmoil and the trouble of my past days in London seemed now to fade from my memory. We were lovers again, we were absorbed again in each other, we would almost fancy that our marriage dated back once more to a day or two since. But one last victory over myself was wanting to make my happiness complete. I still felt secret longings, in those dangerous moments when I was left by myself, to know whether the search for the torn letter had or had not taken place. What wayward creatures we are! With everything that a woman could want to make her happy, I was ready to put that happiness in peril rather than remain ignorant of what was going on at Gleninch. I actually hailed the day when my empty purse gave me an excuse for going to my bank as correspondent on business, and so receiving any letters waiting for me which might be placed in my hands. I applied for my money without knowing what I was about, wondering all the time whether Benjamin had written to me or not. My eyes wandered over the desks and tables in the office, looking for letters furtively. Nothing of the sort was visible. But a man appeared from an inner office, an ugly man, who was yet beautiful to my eyes, for this sufficient reason: he had a letter in his hand, and he said, "Is this for you, ma'am?" A glance at the address showed me Benjamin's handwriting. Had they tried the experiment of recovering the letter? And had they failed? Somebody put my money in my bag, and politely led me out to the little hired carriage which was waiting for me at the door. I remember nothing distinctly until I opened the letter on my way home. The first words told me that the Dust-Heap. Chapter number 45 of The Law and the Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wiebke Müller. The Law and the Lady by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 45. The Dust-Heap Disturbed. My head turned giddy. I was obliged to wait and let my overpowering agitation subside before I could read any more. Looking at the letter again, after an interval, my eyes fell accidentally on a sentence near the end, which surprised and startled me. I stopped the driver of the carriage, at the entrance to the street in which our lodgings were situated, and told him to take me to the beautiful park of Paris, the famous Bois de Boulogne. My object was to gain time enough in this way to read the letter carefully through by myself, and to ascertain whether I ought or ought not to keep the receipt of it a secret before I confronted my husband and his mother at home. This precaution taken, I read the narrative which my good Benjamin had so wisely and so thoughtfully written for me. Treating the various incidents methodically, he began with the report which had arrived, in due course of mail, from our agent in America. Our man had successfully traced the lodge-keeper's daughter and her husband to a small town in one of the Western States. Mr. Playmore's letter of introduction at once secured him a cordial reception from the married pair, and a patient hearing when he stated the object of his voyage across the Atlantic. His first questions led to no very encouraging results. The woman was confused and surprised, and was apparently quite unable to exert her memory to any useful purpose. Fortunately, her husband proved to be a very intelligent man. He took the agent privately aside, and said to him, "I understand my wife, and you don't. Tell me exactly what it is you want to know, and leave it to me to discover how much she remembers and how much she forgets." This sensible suggestion was readily accepted. The agent waited for events a day and a night. Early the next morning the husband said to him, "Talk to my wife now, and you'll find she has something to tell you. Only mind this, don't laugh at her when she speaks of trifles.
She is ashamed to speak of trifles even to me. Thinks men are above such matters, you know. Listen quietly, and let her talk, and you will get at it all in that way."
The agent followed his instructions, and "got at it" as follows. The woman remembered perfectly well being sent to clean the bedrooms and put them tidy, after the gentlefolks had all left Gleninch. Her mother had a bad hip at the time, and could not go with her and help her. She did not much fancy being alone in the great house after what had happened in it. On her way to her work she passed two of the cottagers' children in the neighbourhood at play in the park. Mr. Macallan was always kind to his poor tenants, and never objected to the young ones round about having a run on the grass. The two children idly followed her to the house. She took them inside along with her, not liking the place as already mentioned, and feeling that they would be company in the solitary rooms. She began her work in the guests' corridor, leaving the room in the other corridor in which the death had happened to the last. There was very little to do in the two first rooms. There was not litter enough, when she had swept the floors and cleaned the grates, to even half fill the housemaid's bucket which she carried with her. The children followed her about, and, all things considered, were very good company in the lonely place. The third room, that is to say, the bedchamber which had been occupied by Miserrimus Dexter, was in a much worse state than the other two, and wanted a great deal of tidying. She did not much notice the children here, being occupied with her work. The litter was swept up from the carpet, and the cinders and ashes were taken out of the grate, and the whole of it was in the bucket, when her attention was recalled to the children by hearing one of them cry. She looked about the room without at first discovering them. A fresh outburst of crying led her in the right direction, and showed her the children under a table in a corner of the room. The youngest of the two had got into a waste-paper basket. The eldest had found an old bottle of gum, with a brush fixed in the cork, and was gravely painting the face of the smaller child with what little remained of the contents of the bottle. Some natural struggles, on the part of the little creature, had ended in the overthrow of the basket, and the usual outburst of crying had followed as a matter of course. In this state of things, the remedy was soon applied. The woman took the bottle away from the eldest child, and gave it a box on the ear. The younger one she set on its legs again, and she put the two in the corner to keep them quiet. This done, she swept up such fragments of the torn paper in the basket as had fallen on the floor, threw them back again into the basket along with the gum bottle, fetched the bucket, and emptied the basket into it, and then proceeded to the fourth and last room in the corridor, where she finished her work for that day. Leaving the house with the children after her, she took the filled bucket to the dust-heap, and emptied it in a hollow place among the rubbish, about half-way up the mound. Then she took the children home, and there was an end of it for the day. Such was the result of the appeal made to the woman's memory of domestic events at Gleninch. The conclusion at which Mr. Playmore arrived from the facts submitted to him was that the chances were now decidedly in favour of the recovery of the letter. Thrown in nearly midway between the contents of the housemaid's bucket, the torn morsels would be protected above as well as below when they were emptied on the dust-heap. Succeeding weeks and months would add to that protection, by adding to the accumulated refuse. In the neglected condition of the grounds, the dust-heap had not been disturbed in search of manure. There it had stood untouched from the time when the family left Gleninch to the present day. And there, hidden deep somewhere in the mound, the fragments of the letter must be. Such were the lawyer's conclusions. He had written immediately to communicate them to Benjamin. And thereupon what had Benjamin done? After having tried his powers of construction on his own correspondence, the prospect of experimenting on the mysterious letter itself had proved to be a temptation too powerful for the old man to resist. "I almost fancy, my dear, this business of yours has bewitched me," he wrote. "You see, I have the misfortune to be an idle man. I have time to spare, and money to spare; and the end of it is that I am here at Gleninch, engaged on my own sole responsibility, with good Mr. Playmore's permission, in searching the dust-heap." Benjamin's description of his first view of the field of action at Gleninch followed these characteristic lines of apology. I passed over the description without ceremony. My remembrance of the scene was too vivid to require any prompting of that sort. I saw again, in the dim evening light, the unsightly mound which had so strangely attracted my attention at Gleninch.
I heard again the words in which Mr. Playmore had explained to me the custom of the dust-heap in Scotch country houses. What had Benjamin and Mr. Playmore done? What had Benjamin and Mr. Playmore found? For me the true interest of the narrative was there, and to that portion of it I eagerly turned next. They had proceeded methodically, of course, with one eye on the pounds, shilling, and pence, and the other on the object in view. In Benjamin the lawyer had found what he had not met with in me, a sympathetic mind alive to the value of an abstract of the expenses, and conscious of that most remunerative of human virtues, the virtue of economy. At so much a week they had engaged men to dig into the mound and to sift the ashes. At so much a week they had hired a tent to shelter the open dust-heap from wind and weather. At so much a week they had engaged the service of a young man, personally known to Benjamin, who was employed in a laboratory under a professor of chemistry, and who had distinguished himself by his skilful manipulation of paper in a recent case of forgery on a well-known London firm. Armed with these preparations, they had begun the work. Benjamin and the young chemist living at Gleninch, and taking it in turns to superintend the proceedings. 3 days of labour with the spade and the sieve produced no results of the slightest importance. However, the matter was in the hands of 2 quietly determined men. They declined to be discouraged. They went on. On the 4th day the first morsels of paper were found. Upon examination they proved to be the fragments of a tradesman's prospectus. Nothing dismayed, Benjamin and the young chemist still persevered. At the end of the day's work more pieces of paper were turned up. These proved to be covered with written characters. Mr. Playmore, arriving at Gleninch as usual every evening on the conclusion of his labours in the law, was consulted as to the handwriting. After careful examination, he declared that the mutilated portions of sentences submitted to him had been written, beyond all doubt, by Eustace Macallan's first wife. The discovery aroused the enthusiasm of the searchers to fever height. Spades and sieves were from that moment forbidden utensils. However unpleasant the task might be, hands alone were used in the further examination of the mound. The first and foremost necessity was to place the morsels of paper in flat cardboard boxes prepared for the purpose, in their order as they were found. Night came, the labourers were dismissed. Benjamin and his 2 colleagues worked on by lamplight. The morsels of paper were now turned up by dozens instead of by ones and twos. For a while the search prospered in this way, and then the morsels appeared no more. Had they all been recovered, or would renewed hand-digging yield more yet? The next light layers of rubbish were carefully removed, and the grand discovery of the day followed. There, upside down, was the gum bottle which the lodge-keeper's daughter had spoken of; and, more precious still, there under it were more fragments of written paper, all stuck together in a little clump by the last drippings from the gum bottle dropping upon them as they lay on the dust-heap. The scene now shifted to the interior of the house. When the searchers next assembled, they met at the great table in the library at Gleninch. Benjamin's experience with the puzzles which he had put together in the days of his boyhood proved to be of some use to his companions. The fragments accidentally stuck together would, in all probability, be found to fit each other, and would certainly, in any case, be the easiest fragments to reconstruct as a centre to start from. The delicate business of separating these pieces of paper, and of preserving them in the order in which they had adhered to each other, was assigned to the practised fingers of the chemist. But the difficulties of his task did not end here. The writing was, as usual in letters, traced on both sides of the paper, and it could only be preserved for the purpose of reconstruction by splitting each morsel into 2, so as artificially to make a blank side, on which could be spread the fine cement used for reuniting the fragments in their original form. To Mr. Playmore and Benjamin the prospect of successfully putting the letter together, under these disadvantages, seemed to be almost hopeless. Their skilled colleague soon satisfied them that they were wrong. He drew their attention to the thickness of the paper, note paper of the strongest and best quality, on which the writing was traced. It was of more than twice the substance of the last paper on which he had operated when he was engaged in the forgery case, and it was, on that account, comparatively easy for him, aided by the mechanical appliances which he had brought from London, to split the morsel of the torn paper within a given space of time which might permit them to begin the reconstruction of the letter that night. With these explanations he had quietly devoted himself to his work. While Benjamin and the lawyer were still poring over the scattered morsels of the letter which had been first discovered, and trying to piece them together again, the chemist had divided the greater part of the fragments specially confided to him into two halves each, and had correctly put together some 5 or 6 sentences of the letter on the smooth sheet of cardboard prepared for that purpose. They looked eagerly at the reconstructed writing so far. It was correctly done, the sense was perfect. The first result gained by examination was remarkable enough to reward them for all their exertions. The language used plainly identified the person to whom the late Mrs. Eustace had addressed her letter. That person was my husband; and the letter thus addressed, if the plainest circumstantial evidence could be trusted, was identical with the letter which Miserrimus Dexter had suppressed until the trial was over, and had then destroyed by tearing it up. These were the discoveries that had been made at the time when Benjamin wrote to me. He had been on the point of posting his letter when Mr. Playmore had suggested that he should keep it by him for a few days longer, on the chance of having more still to tell me. "We are indebted to her for these results," the lawyer had said. "But for her resolution and her influence over Miserrimus Dexter, we should never have discovered what the Dust-Heap was hiding from us. We should never have seen so much as a glimmering of the truth. She has the first claim to the fullest information. Let her have it." The letter had been accordingly kept back for 3 days. That interval being at an end, it was hurriedly resumed, and concluded in terms which indescribably alarmed me. "The chemist is advancing rapidly with his part of the work," Benjamin wrote; "and I have succeeded in putting together a separate portion of the torn writing which makes sense. Comparison of what he has accomplished with what I have accomplished has led to startling conclusions. Unless Mr. Playmore and I are entirely wrong (and God grant we may be so), there is a serious necessity for your keeping the reconstruction of the letter strictly secret from everybody about you. The disclosures suggested by what has come to light are so heart-rending and so dreadful that I cannot bring myself to write about them until I am absolutely obliged to do so. Please forgive me for disturbing you with this news. We are bound, sooner or later, to consult with you in the matter, and we think it right to prepare your mind for what may be to come." To this there was added a postscript in Mr. Playmore's handwriting. "Pray observe strictly the caution which Mr. Benjamin impresses on you, and bear this in mind as a warning from me. If we succeed in reconstructing the entire letter, the last person
Chapter number 46 of The Law and the Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wiebke Müller. The Law and the Lady by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 46. The Crisis Deferred. "Take care, Valeria," said Mrs. Macallan. "I ask you no questions. I only caution you for your own sake. Eustace has noticed what I have noticed. Eustace has seen a change in you. Take care." So my mother-in-law spoke to me later in the day, when we happened to be alone. I had done my best to conceal all traces of the effect produced on me by the strange and terrible news from Gleninch. But who could read what I had read, who could feel what I now felt, and still maintain an undisturbed serenity of look and manner? If I had been the vilest hypocrite living, I doubt even then if my face could have kept my secret while my mind was full of Benjamin's letter. Having spoken her word of caution, Mrs. Macallan made no further advance to me. I dare say she was right.
Still it seemed hard to be left without a word of advice or of sympathy, to decide for myself what it was my duty to my husband to do next. To show him Benjamin's narrative, in his state of health, and in the face of the warning addressed to me, was simply out of the question. At the same time, it was equally impossible, after I had already betrayed myself, to keep him entirely in the dark. I thought over it anxiously in the night. When the morning came, I decided to appeal to my husband's confidence in me. I went straight to the point in these terms. "Eustace, your mother said yesterday that you noticed a change in me when I came back from my drive. Is she right?" "Quite right, Valeria," he answered, speaking in lower tones than usual, and not looking at me. "We have no concealments from each other now," I answered. "I ought to tell you, and do tell you, that I found a letter from England waiting at the banker's, which has caused me some agitation and alarm. Will you leave it to me to choose my own time for speaking more plainly? And will you believe, love, that I am really doing my duty toward you as a good wife in making this request?" I paused. He made no answer. I could see that he was secretly struggling with himself. Had I ventured too far? Had I overestimated the strength of my influence? My heart beat fast, my voice faltered, but I summoned courage enough to take his hand, and to make a last appeal to him. "Eustace," I said, "don't you know me yet well enough to trust me?" He turned toward me for the first time. I saw a last vanishing trace of doubt in his eyes as they looked into mine. "You promise, sooner or later, to tell me the whole truth?" he said. "I promise with all my heart." "I trust you, Valeria." His brightening eyes told me that he really meant what he said. We sealed our compact with a kiss. Pardon me for mentioning these trifles. I am still writing, if you will kindly remember it, of our new honeymoon. By that day's post I answered Benjamin's letter, telling him what I had done, and entreating him, if he and Mr. Playmore approved of my conduct, to keep me informed of any future discoveries which they might make at Gleninch. After an interval, an endless interval, as it seemed to me, of 10 days more, I received a second letter from my old friend, with another postscript added by Mr. Playmore. "We are advancing steadily and successfully with the putting together of the letter," Benjamin wrote. "The one new discovery which we have made is of serious importance to your husband. We have constructed certain sentences declaring, in the plainest words, that the arsenic which Eustace procured was purchased at the request of his wife, and was in her possession at Gleninch. This, remember, is in the handwriting of the wife, and is signed by the wife, as we have also found out. Unfortunately, I am obliged to add that the objection to taking your husband into our confidence, mentioned when I last wrote, still remains in force, in greater force, I may say, than ever. The more we make out of the letter, the more inclined we are, if we only studied our own feelings, to throw it back into the dust-heap, in mercy to the memory of the unhappy writer. I shall keep this open for a day or two. If there is more news to tell you by that time, you will hear of it from Mr. Playmore." Mr. Playmore's postscript followed, dated 3 days later. "The concluding part of the late Mrs. Macallan's letter to your husband," the lawyer wrote, "has proved accidentally to be the first part which we have succeeded in piecing together. With the exception of a few gaps still left, here and there, the writing of the closing paragraphs has been perfectly reconstructed. I have neither the time nor the inclination to write to you on this sad subject in any detail. In a fortnight more, at the longest, we shall, I hope, send you a copy of the letter, complete from the first line to the last. Meanwhile, it is my duty to tell you that there is one bright side to this otherwise deplorable and shocking document. Legally speaking, as well as morally speaking, it absolutely vindicates your husband's innocence; and it may be lawfully used for this purpose, if he can reconcile it to his conscience, and to the mercy due to the memory of the dead, to permit the public exposure of the letter in court. Understand me, he cannot be tried again on what we call the criminal charge, for certain technical reasons with which I need not trouble you. But if the facts which were involved at the criminal trial can also be shown to be involved in a civil action, and in this case they can, the entire matter may be made the subject of a new legal inquiry, and the verdict of a second jury, completely vindicating your husband, may thus be obtained. Keep this information to yourself for the present. Preserve the position which you have so sensibly adopted towards Eustace, until you have read the restored letter. When you have done this, my own idea is that you will shrink, in pity to him, from letting him see it. How he is to be kept in ignorance of what we have discovered is another question, the discussion of which must be deferred until we can consult together. Until that time comes, I can only repeat my advice. Wait till the next news reaches you from Gleninch." I waited. What I suffered, what Eustace thought of me, does not matter. Nothing matters now but the facts. In less than a fortnight more, the task of restoring the letter was completed. Excepting certain instances in which the morsel of the torn paper had been irretrievably lost, and in which it had been necessary to complete the sentence in harmony with the writer's intention, the whole letter had been put together, and the promised copy of it was forwarded to me in Paris. Before you, too, read that dreadful letter, do me one favour. Let me briefly remind you of the circumstances under which Eustace Macallan married his first wife. Remember that the poor creature fell in love with him without awakening any corresponding affection on his side. Remember that he separated himself from her, and did all he could to avoid her when he found this out. Remember that she presented herself at his residence in London without a word of warning, that he did his best to save her reputation, that he failed through no fault of his own, and that he rashly ended, in a moment of despair, by marrying her, to silence the scandal that must otherwise have blighted her life as a woman for the rest of her days. Bear all this in mind. It is the sworn testimony of respectable witnesses; and pray do not forget, however foolishly and blamable he may have written about her in the secret pages of his diary, that he was proved to have done his best to conceal from his wife the aversion which the poor soul inspired in him, and that he was, in the opinion of those who could best judge him, at least a courteous and a considerate husband, if he could be no more. And now take the letter. It asks but one favour of you. It asks to be read.
Chapter 47 of The Law and the Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wiebke Müller. The Law and the Lady by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 47. The Wife's Confession. Gleninch, October 19th, 1800 something. My husband, I have something very painful to tell you about one of your oldest friends. You have never encouraged me to come to you with any confidence of mine. If you had allowed me to be as familiar with you as some wives are with their husbands, I should have spoken to you personally instead of writing. As it is, I don't know how you might receive what I have to say to you if I said it by word of mouth. So I write. The man against whom I warn you is still a guest in this house, Miserrimus Dexter. No falser or wickeder creature walks the earth. Don't throw my letter aside. I have waited to say this until I could find proof that might satisfy you. I have got the proof. You may remember that I ventured to express some disapproval when you first told me you had asked this man to visit us. If you had allowed me time to explain myself, I might have been bold enough to give you a good reason for the aversion I felt towards your friend. But you would not wait. You hastily and most unjustly accused me of feeling prejudiced against the miserable creature on account of his deformity. No other feeling than compassion for deformed persons has ever entered my mind.
I have indeed almost a fellow feeling for them, being the next worst thing myself to a deformity, a plain woman. I object to Mr. Dexter as your guest, because he had asked me to be his wife in past days, and because I had reason to fear that he still regarded me, after my marriage, with a guilty and horrible love. Was it not my duty as a good wife to object to his being your guest at Gleninch? And was it not your duty as a good husband to encourage me to say more? Well, Mr. Dexter has been your guest for many weeks, and Mr. Dexter has dared to speak to me again of his love. He has insulted me, and insulted you, by declaring that he adores me, and that you hate me. He has promised me a life of unalloyed happiness, in a foreign country, with my lover, and he has prophesied for me a life of unendurable misery at home with my husband. Why did I not make my complaint to you, and have this monster dismissed from the house at once and forever? Are you sure you would have believed me if I had complained, and if your bosom friend had denied all intention of insulting me? I heard you once say, when you were not aware that I was within hearing, that the vainest women are always the ugly women. You might have accused me of vanity, who knows? But I have no desire to shelter myself under this excuse. I am a jealous, unhappy creature, always doubtful of your affection for me, always fearing that another woman has got my place in your heart. Miserrimus Dexter has practised on this weakness of mine. He has declared he can prove to me, if I will permit him, that I am in your secret heart an object of loathing to you, that you shrink from touching me, that you curse the hour when you were foolish enough to make me your wife. I have struggled as long as I could against the temptation to let him produce his proofs. It was a terrible temptation to a woman who was far from feeling sure of the sincerity of your affection for her, and it has ended in getting the better of my resistance. I wickedly concealed the disgust which the wretch inspired in me. I wickedly gave him leave to explain himself. I wickedly permitted this enemy of yours and of mine to take me into his confidence. And why? Because I loved you, and you only, and because Miserrimus Dexter's proposal did, after all, echo a doubt of you that had long been gnawing secretly at my heart. Forgive me, Eustace. This is my first sin against you. It shall be my last. I will not spare myself. I will write a full confession of what I said to him and of what he said to me. You may make me suffer for it when you know what I have done, but you will at least be warned in time. You will see your false friend in his true light. I said to him, 'How can you prove to me that my husband hates me in secret?' He answered, 'I can prove it under his own handwriting. You shall see it in his diary.' I said, 'His diary has a lock, and the drawer in which he keeps it has a lock. How can you get at the diary and the drawer?' He answered, 'I have my own way of getting at both of them, without the slightest risk of being discovered by your husband. All you have to do is to give me the opportunity of seeing you privately. I will engage in return to bring the open diary with me to your room.' I said, 'How can I give you the opportunity? What do you mean?' He pointed to the key in the door of communication between my room and the little study. He said, 'With my infirmity, I may not be able to profit by the first opportunity of visiting you here unobserved. I must be able to choose my own time, and my own way of getting to you secretly. Let me take this key, leaving the door locked. When the key is missed, if you say it doesn't matter, if you point out that the door is locked, and tell the servants not to trouble themselves about finding the key, there will be no disturbance in the house, and I shall be in secure possession of a means of communication with you which no one will suspect. Will you do this?' I have done it. Yes, I have become the accomplice of this double-faced villain. I have degraded myself and outraged you by making an appointment to pry into your diary. I know how base my conduct is. I can make no excuse. I can only repeat that I love you, and that I am sorely afraid you don't love me. And Miserrimus Dexter offers to end my doubts by showing me the most secret thoughts of your heart in your own writing. He is to be with me for this purpose while you are out, some time in the course of the next 2 hours. I shall decline to be satisfied with only once looking at your diary, and I shall make an appointment with him to bring it to me again at the same time tomorrow. Before then, you will receive these lines by the hands of my nurse. Go out as usual after reading them, but return privately and unlock the table drawer in which you keep your book. You will find it gone. Post yourself quietly in the little study, and you will discover the diary, when Miserrimus Dexter leaves me, in the hands of your friend. Note by Mr. Playmore. The greatest difficulties of reconstruction occurred in this first portion of the torn letter. In the 4th paragraph from the beginning, we have been obliged to supply lost words in no less than 3 places. In the 9th, 10th, and 17th paragraph, the same proceeding was, in a greater or lesser degree, found to be necessary. In all these cases, the utmost pains have been taken to supply the deficiency in exact accordance with what happened to be the meaning of the writer, as indicated in the existing pieces of the manuscript. October 20th. I have read your diary. At last I know what you really think of me. I have read what Miserrimus Dexter promised I should read. The confession of your loathing of me, in your own handwriting. You will not receive what I wrote to you yesterday, at the time or in the manner which I had proposed. Long as my letter is, I have still, after reading your diary, some more words to add. After I have closed and sealed the envelope, and addressed it to you, I shall put it under my pillow. It will be found there when I am laid out for the grave. And then, Eustace, when it is too late for hope or help, my letter will be given to you. Yes, I have had enough of my life. Yes, I mean to die. I have already sacrificed everything but my life to my love for you. Now I know that my love is not returned, the last sacrifice left is easy. My death will set you free to marry Mrs. Bowley. You don't know what it cost me to control my hatred of her, and to beg her to pay her visit here without minding my illness. I could never have done it if I had not been so fond of you, and so fearful of irritating you against me by showing my jealousy. And how did you reward me? Let your diary answer. I tenderly embraced her this very morning, and I hope, poor soul, she did not discover the effort that it cost me. Well, I have discovered it now. I know that you privately think your life with me a purgatory. I know that you have compassionately hidden from me the sense of shrinking that comes over you when you are obliged to submit to my caresses. I am nothing but an obstacle, an utterly distasteful obstacle, between you and the woman whom you love so dearly that you adore the earth which she touches with her foot. Be it so. I will stand in your way no longer. It is no sacrifice, and no merit on my part. Life is unendurable to me, now I know that the man whom I love with all my heart and soul secretly shrinks from me whenever I touch him. I have got the means of death close at hand. The arsenic that I twice asked you to buy for me is in my dressing-case. I deceived you when I mentioned some commonplace domestic reasons for wanting it. My true reason was to try if I could not improve my ugly complexion, not from any vain feeling of mine, only to make myself look better and more lovable in your eyes. I have taken some of it for that purpose, but I have got plenty left to kill myself with. The poison will have its use at last. It might have failed to improve my complexion. It will not fail to relieve you of your ugly wife. Don't let me be examined after death. Show this letter to the doctor who attends me. It will tell him that I have committed suicide. It will prevent any innocent persons from being suspected of poisoning me. I want nobody to be blamed or punished. I shall remove the chemist's label, and carefully empty the bottle containing the poison, so that he may not suffer on my account. I must wait here, and rest a little while, then take up my letter again. It's far too long already, but these are my farewell words. I may surely dwell a little on my last talk with you. October 21st, 2 o'clock in the morning. I sent you out of the room yesterday when you came in to ask how I had passed the night. And I spoke of you shamefully, Eustace, after you had gone to the hired nurse who attends on me. Forgive me, I'm almost beside myself now. You know why. 3:30. Oh, my husband, I have done the deed which will relieve you of the wife whom you hate. I have taken the poison, all of it that was left in the paper packet, which was the first that I found. If it's not enough to kill me, I have more left in the bottle. 5:10. You've just gone after giving me my composing draught. My courage failed me at the sight of you. I thought to myself, if you look at me kindly, I will confess what I've done, and let him save my life. You never looked at me at all. You only looked at the medicine. I let you go without saying a word. 5:30. I begin to feel the first effects of the poison. The nurse is asleep at the foot of my bed. I won't call for assistance. I won't wake her. I will die. 9:30. The agony was beyond my endurance. I awoke the nurse. I have seen the doctor. Nobody suspects anything. Strange to say, the pain has left me. I have evidently taken too little of the poison. I must open the bottle which contains the larger quantity. Fortunately, you are not near me. My resolution to die, or rather, my loathing of life, remains as bitterly unaltered as ever. To make sure of my courage, I have forbidden the nurse to send for you. She has just gone downstairs by my orders. I am free to get the poison out of my dressing-case. 10:10. I had just time to hide the bottle, after the nurse had left me, when you came into my room. I had another moment of weakness when I saw you. I determined to give myself a last chance of life. That is to say, I determined to offer you a last opportunity of treating me kindly. I asked you to get me a cup of tea. If, in paying me this little attention, you only encouraged me by one fond word or one fond look, I resolved not to take the second dose of poison. You obeyed my wishes, but you were not kind. You gave me my tea, Eustace, as if you were giving a drink to your dog. And then you wondered in a languid way, thinking, I suppose, of Mrs. Bowley all the time, at my dropping the cup in handing it back to you. I really could not help it. My hand would tremble. In my place, your hand might have trembled too, with the arsenic under the bedclothes. You politely hoped, before you went away, that the tea would do me good. And, oh God, you could not even look at me when you said that. You looked at the broken bits of the teacup. The instant you were out of the room, I took the poison. A double dose this time. I have a little request to make here, while I think of it. After removing the label from the bottle and putting it back clean in my dressing-case, it struck me that I'd failed to take the same precaution in the early morning with the empty paper packet, bearing on it the name of the other chemist. I threw it aside on the counterpane of the bed, among some other loose papers. My ill-tempered nurse complained of the litter, and crumpled them all up and put them away somewhere. I hope the chemist will not suffer through my carelessness. Pray bear it in mind to say that he is not to blame. Dexter. Something reminds me of Miserrimus Dexter. He's put your diary back again in the drawer, and he presses me for an answer to his proposal. Has this false wretch any conscience? If he has, even he will suffer, when my death answers him. The nurse has been in my room again. I've sent her away. I have told her I want to be alone. How's the time going? I cannot find my watch. Is the pain coming back again and paralyzing me? I don't feel it keenly yet. It may come back, though, at any moment. I have still to close my letter and to address it to you, and besides I must save up my strength to hide it under the pillow, so that nobody may find it until after my death. Farewell, my dear. I wish I had been a prettier woman, a more loving woman toward you I could not be. Even now I dread the sight of your dear face. Even now, if I allowed myself the luxury of looking at you, I don't know that you might not charm me into confessing what I have done, before it is too late to save me. But you are not here. Better as it is, better as it is. Once more farewell. Be happier than you have been with me. I love you, Eustace. I forgive you. When you have nothing else to think about, think sometimes, as kindly as you can, of your poor, ugly Sarah Macallan. Note by Mr. Playmore. The lost words and phrases supplied in this concluding portion of the letter are so few in number that it is needless to mention them. The fragments which were found accidentally stuck together by the gum, and which represent the part of the letter first completely reconstructed, begin at the phrase, "I spoke of you shamefully, Eustace," and end with the broken sentence, "If in paying me this little attention you only encouraged me by one fond word or one fond look, I resolved not to take." With the assistance thus afforded to us, the labour of putting together the concluding half of the letter, dated October 20th, was trifling, compared with the almost insurmountable.
Chapter 48 of The Law and the Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wiebke Müller. The Law and the Lady by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 48. What else could I do? As soon as I could dry my eyes and compose my spirits after reading the wife's pitiable and dreadful farewell, my first thought was of Eustace. My first anxiety was to prevent him from ever reading what I had read. Yes, to this end it had come. I had devoted my life to the attainment of one object, and that object I had gained. There, on the table before me, lay the triumphant vindication of my husband's innocence, and in mercy to him, in mercy to the memory of his dead wife, my one hope was that he might never see it. My one desire was to hide it from the public view. I looked back at the strange circumstances under which the letter had been discovered. It was all my doing, as the lawyer had said. And yet, what I had done, I had, so to speak, done blindfold. The merest accident might have altered the whole course of later events. I had over and over again interfered to check Ariel when she entreated the master to tell her a story. If she had not succeeded, in spite of my opposition, Miserrimus Dexter's last effort of memory might never have been directed to the tragedy at Gleninch. And again, if I had only remembered to move my chair, and so to give Benjamin the signal to leave off, he would never have written down the apparently senseless words which have led us to the discovery of the truth. Looking back at events in this frame of mind, the very sight of the letter sickened and horrified me. I cursed the day which had disinterred the fragments of it from their foul tomb. Just at the time when Eustace had found his weary way back to health and strength, just at the time when we were united again, and happy again, when a month or two more might make us father and mother, as well as husband and wife, that frightful record of suffering and sin had risen against us like an avenging spirit. There it faced me on the table, threatening my husband's tranquillity, nay, for all I knew, if he had read it at the present critical stage of his recovery, even threatening his life. The hour struck from the clock on the mantelpiece. It was Eustace's time for paying me his morning visit in my own little room. He might come in at any moment. He might see the letter. He might snatch the letter out of my hand. In a frenzy of terror and loathing, I caught up the vile sheets of paper and threw them into the fire. It was a fortunate thing that a copy only had been sent to me. If the original letter had been in its place, I believe I should have burnt the original at that moment. The last morsel of paper had been barely consumed by the flames when the door opened and Eustace came in. He glanced at the fire. The black cinders of the burnt paper were still floating at the back of the grate. He had seen the letter brought to me at the breakfast table. Did he suspect what I had done? He said nothing. He stood gravely looking into the fire. Then he advanced and fixed his eyes on me. I suppose I was very pale. The first words he spoke were words which asked me if I felt ill. I was determined not to deceive him, even in the merest trifle. "I am feeling a little nervous, Eustace," I answered, "that's all." He looked at me again, as if he expected me to say something more. I remained silent.
He took a letter out of the breast pocket of his coat, and laid it on the table before me, just where the confession had lain before I destroyed it. "I have had a letter too this morning," he said. "And I, Valeria, have no secrets from you." I understood the reproach which my husband's last words conveyed, but I made no attempt to answer him. "Do you wish me to read it?" was all I said, pointing to the envelope which he had laid on the table. "I have already said that I have no secrets from you," he repeated. "The envelope is open. See for yourself what is enclosed in it." I took out, not a letter, but a printed paragraph cut from a Scotch newspaper. "Read it," said Eustace. I read as follows: "Strange doings at Gleninch. A romance in real life seems to be in course of progress at Mr. Macallan's country house. Private excavations are taking place, if our readers will pardon us the unsavoury allusion, at the Dust-Heap, of all places in the world. Something has assuredly been discovered, but nobody knows what. This alone is certain. For weeks past, two strangers from London, superintended by our respected fellow citizen, Mr. Playmore, have been at work night and day in the library at Gleninch, with the door locked. Will the secret ever be revealed? And will it throw any light on a mysterious and shocking event, which our readers have learned to associate with the past history of Gleninch? Perhaps when Mr. Macallan returns, he may be able to answer these questions. In the meantime, we can only await events." I laid the newspaper slip on the table, in no very Christian frame of mind toward the persons concerned in producing it. Some reporter in search of news had evidently been prying about the grounds at Gleninch, and some busybody in the neighbourhood had in all probability sent the published paragraph to Eustace. Entirely at a loss what to do, I waited for my husband to speak. He did not keep me in suspense. He questioned me instantly. "Do you understand what it means, Valeria?" I answered honestly. I owned that I understood what it meant. He waited again, as if he expected me to say more. I still kept the only refuge left to me, the refuge of silence. "Am I to know no more than I know now?" he proceeded, after an interval. "Are you not bound to tell me what is going on in my own house?" It is a common remark that people, if they can think at all, think quickly in emergencies. There was but one way out of the embarrassing position in which my husband's last words had placed me. My instincts showed me the way, I suppose. At any rate, I took it. "You have promised to trust me," I began. He admitted that he had promised. "I must ask you, for your own sake, Eustace, to trust me for a little while longer. I will satisfy you, if you will only give me time." His face darkened. "How much longer must I wait?" he asked. I saw that the time had come for trying some stronger form of persuasion than words. "Kiss me," I said, "before I tell you." He hesitated, so like a husband; and I persisted, so like a wife. There was no choice for him but to yield. Having given me my kiss not over graciously he insisted once more on knowing how much longer I wanted him to wait. "I want you to wait," I answered, "until our child is born." He started. My condition took him by surprise. I gently pressed his hand, and gave him a look. He returned the look, warmly enough this time to satisfy me. "Say you consent," I whispered. He consented. So I put off the day of reckoning once more. So I gained time to consult again with Benjamin and Mr. Playmore. While Eustace remained with me in the room, I was composed and capable of talking to him. But when he left me, after a time, to think over what had passed between us, and to remember how kindly he had given way to me, my heart turned pityingly to those other wives better women, some of them, than I am whose husbands, under similar circumstances, would have spoken hard words to them, would perhaps even have acted more cruelly still. The contrast thus suggested between their fate and mine quite overcame me. What had I done to deserve my happiness? What had they done, poor souls, to deserve their misery? My nerves were overwrought, I dare say, after reading the dreadful confession
Chapter number 49 of The Law and the Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wiebke Müller. The Law and the Lady by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 49. Past and Future. I write from memory, unassisted by notes or diaries, and I have no distinct recollection of the length of our residence abroad. It certainly extended over a period of some months. Long after Eustace was strong enough to take the journey to London, the doctors persisted in keeping him in Paris. He had shown symptoms of weakness in one of his lungs, and his medical advisers, seeing that he prospered in the dry atmosphere of France, warned him to be careful of breathing too soon the moist air of his own country. Thus it happened that we were still in Paris when I received my next news from Gleninch. This time no letters passed on either side. To my surprise and delight, Benjamin quietly made his appearance one morning in our pretty French drawing-room. He was so preternaturally smart in his dress, and so incomprehensibly anxious, while my husband was in the way, to make us understand that his reasons for visiting Paris were holiday reasons only, that I at once suspected him of having crossed the Channel in a double character, say, as tourist in search of pleasure, when third persons were present, as ambassador from Mr. Playmore, when he and I had the room to ourselves. Later in the day I contrived that we should be left together, and I soon found that my anticipations had not misled me. Benjamin had set out from Paris, at Mr. Playmore's express request, to consult with me as to the future and to enlighten me as to the past. He presented me with his credentials in the shape of a little note from the lawyer. "There are some few points," Mr. Playmore wrote, "which the recovery of the letter does not seem to clear up. I have done my best, with Mr. Benjamin's assistance, to find the right explanation of these debatable matters, and I have treated the subject, for the sake of brevity, in the form of questions and answers. Will you accept me as interpreter, after the mistakes I made when you consulted me in Edinburgh? Events, I admit, have proved that I was entirely wrong in trying to prevent you from returning to Dexter, and partially wrong in suspecting Dexter of being directly, instead of indirectly, answerable for the first Mrs. Eustace's death. I frankly make my confession, and leave you to tell Mr. Benjamin whether you think my new catechism worthy of examination or not." I thought his new catechism, as he called it, decidedly worthy of examination. If you don't agree with this view, and if you are dying to be done with me and my narrative, pass on to the next chapter by all means. Benjamin produced the questions and answers, and read them to me at my request, in these terms. Questions suggested by the letter discovered at Gleninch. First group. Questions relating to the diary. First question. Obtaining access to Mr. Macallan's private journal, was Miserrimus Dexter guided by any previous knowledge of its contents? Answer. It is doubtful if he had any such knowledge. The probabilities are that he noticed how carefully Mr. Macallan secured his diary from observation, that he inferred therefrom the existence of dangerous domestic secrets in the locked-up pages, and that he speculated on using those secrets for his own purpose when he caused the false keys to be made. Second question. To what motive are we to attribute Miserrimus Dexter's interference with the sheriff's officers, on the day when they seized Mr. Macallan's diary along with his other papers? Answer. In replying to this question, we must first do justice to Dexter himself. Infamously as we now know him to have acted, the man was not a downright fiend. That he secretly hated Mr. Macallan as his successful rival in the affections of the woman he loved, and that he did all he could to induce the unhappy lady to desert her husband, are in this case facts not to be denied. On the other hand, it is fairly to be doubted whether he were additionally capable of permitting the friend who trusted him to be tried for murder, through his fault, without making an effort to save the innocent man. It had naturally never occurred to Mr. Macallan, being guiltless of his wife's death, to destroy his diary and his letters, in the fear that they might be used against him.
Until the prompt and secret action of the Fiscal took him by surprise, the idea of his being charged with the murder of his wife was an idea which we know, from his own statement, had never even entered his mind. But Dexter must have looked at the matter from another point of view. In his last wandering words, spoken when his mind broke down, he refers to the Diary in these terms: "The Diary will hang him, I won't have him hanged." If he could have found his opportunity of getting at it in time, or if the sheriff's officers had not been too quick for him, there can be no reasonable doubt that Dexter would have himself destroyed the Diary, foreseeing the consequences of its production in court. So strongly does he appear to have felt these considerations, that he even resisted the officers in the execution of their duty. His agitation, when he sent for Mr. Playmore to interfere, was witnessed by that gentleman, and, it may not be amiss to add, was genuine agitation beyond dispute. Questions of the second group, relating to the wife's confession. First question. What prevented Dexter from destroying the letter when he first discovered it under the dead woman's pillow? Answer: the same motives which led him to resist the seizure of the Diary, and to give his evidence in the prisoner's favour at the trial, induced him to preserve the letter until the verdict was known. Looking back once more at his last words, as taken down by Benjamin, he may infer that if the verdict had been guilty, he would not have hesitated to save the innocent husband by producing the wife's confession. There are degrees in all wickedness. Dexter was wicked enough to suppress the letter, which wounded his vanity by revealing him as an object for loathing and contempt; but he was not wicked enough deliberately to let an innocent man perish on the scaffold. He was capable of exposing the rival whom he hated to the infamy and torture of a public accusation of murder; but in the event of an adverse verdict he shrank before the direr cruelty of letting him be hanged. Reflect, in this connection, on what he must have suffered, villain as he was, when he first read the wife's confession. He had calculated on undermining her affection for her husband, and whither had his calculations led him? He had driven the woman whom he loved to the last dreadful refuge of death by suicide. Give these considerations their due weight, and you will understand that some little redeeming virtue might show itself as the result even of this man's remorse. Second question. What motive influenced Miserrimus Dexter's conduct, when Mrs. Valeria Macallan informed him that she proposed reopening the inquiry into the poisoning at Gleninch? Answer: in all probability Dexter's guilty fears suggested to him that he might have been watched on the morning when he secretly entered the chamber in which the first Mrs. Eustace lay dead. Feeling no scruples himself to restrain him from listening at doors and looking through keyholes, he would be all the more ready to suspect other people of the same practices. With this dread in mind, it would naturally occur to his mind that Mrs. Valeria might meet with the person who had watched him, and might hear all that the person had discovered, unless he let her astray at the outset of her investigations. Her own jealous suspicion of Mrs. Beauly offered him the chance of easily doing this, and he was all the readier to profit by the chance, being himself animated by the most hostile feeling toward that lady. He knew her as the enemy who destroyed the domestic peace of the mistress of the house. He loved the mistress of the house, and he hated her enemy accordingly. The preservation of his guilty secret, and the persecution of Mrs. Beauly, there you have the greater and the lesser motive of his conduct in his relations with Mrs. Eustace the second. Note by the writer of the narrative. Look back for a further illustration of this point of view to the scene at Benjamin's house, Chapter 35, where Dexter, in a moment of ungovernable agitation, betrays his own secret to Valeria. Benjamin laid down his notes and took off his spectacles. "We have not thought it necessary to go further than this," he said. "Is there any point you can think of that is still left unexplained?" I reflected.
There was no point of any importance left unexplained that I could remember; but there was one little matter suggested by the recent allusions to Mrs. Beauly which I wished if possible to have thoroughly cleared up. "Have you and Mr. Playmore ever spoken together on the subject of my husband's former attachment to Mrs. Beauly?" I asked. "Has Mr. Playmore ever told you why Eustace did not marry her after the trial?" "I put that question to Mr. Playmore myself," said Benjamin. "He answered it easily enough. Being your husband's confidential friend and adviser, he was consulted when Mr. Eustace wrote to Mrs. Beauly after the trial, and he repeated the substance of the letter at my request. Would you like to hear what I remember of it, in my turn?" I owned that I should like to hear it. What Benjamin thereupon told me exactly coincided with what Miserrimus Dexter had told me, as related in the 13th chapter of my narrative. Mrs. Beauly had been a witness of the public degradation of my husband. That was enough in itself to prevent him from marrying her. He broke off with her for the same reason which had led him to separate himself from me. Existence with a woman who knew that he had been tried for his life as a murderer was an existence which he had not resolution enough to face. The two accounts agreed in every particular. At last my jealous curiosity was pacified, and Benjamin was free to dismiss the past from further consideration, and to approach the more critical and more interesting topic of the future. His first inquiries related to Eustace. He asked if my husband had any suspicion of the proceedings which had taken place at Gleninch. I told him what had happened, and how I had contrived to put off the inevitable disclosure for a time. My old friend's face cleared up as he listened to me. "This will be good news for Mr. Playmore," he said. "Our excellent friend the lawyer is sorely afraid that our discoveries may compromise your position with your husband. On the one hand, he is naturally anxious to spare Mr. Eustace the distress which he must certainly feel if he read his first wife's confession. On the other hand, it is impossible in justice, as Mr. Playmore puts it, to the unborn children of your marriage to suppress a document which vindicates the memory of their father from the aspersion that the Scotch verdict might otherwise cast on it." I listened attentively. Benjamin had touched on a trouble which was still secretly preying on my mind. "How does Mr. Playmore propose to meet the difficulty?" I asked. "He can only meet it in one way," Benjamin replied. "He proposes to seal up the original manuscript of the letter, and to add it to a plain statement of the circumstances under which it was discovered, supported by your signed attestation and mine as witnesses to the fact. This done, he must leave it to you to take your husband into your confidence at your own time. It will then be for Mr. Eustace to decide whether he will open the enclosure, or whether he will leave it, with the seal unbroken, as an heirloom to his children, to be made public or not at their discretion, when they are of an age to think for themselves. Do you consent to this, my dear? Or would you prefer that Mr. Playmore should see your husband and act for you in the matter?" I decided without hesitation to take the responsibility on myself. Where the question of guiding Eustace's decision was concerned, I considered my influence to be decidedly superior to the influence of Mr. Playmore. My choice met with Benjamin's full approval. He arranged to write to Edinburgh, and relieve the lawyer's anxieties by that day's post. The one last thing now left to be settled related to our plans for returning to England. The doctors were the authorities on this subject. I promised to consult them about it at their next visit to Eustace. "Have you anything more to say to me?" Benjamin inquired, as he opened his writing case. I thought of Miserrimus Dexter and Ariel, and I inquired if he had heard any news of them lately. My old friend sighed, and warned me that I had touched on a painful subject. "The best thing that can happen to that unhappy man is likely to happen," he said. "The one change in him is a change that threatens paralysis. You may hear of his death before you get back to England." "And Ariel?" I asked. "Quite unaltered," Benjamin answered. "Perfectly happy so long as she is with the Master. From all I can hear of her, poor soul, she doesn't reckon Dexter among mortal beings. She laughs at the idea of his dying, and she waits patiently, in the firm persuasion that he will recognize Chapter 50 of The Law and the Lady. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wiebke Müller. The Law and the Lady by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 50. The last of the story. In 10 days more we returned to England, accompanied by Benjamin. Mrs. Macallan's house in London offered us ample accommodation. We gladly availed ourselves of her proposal, when she invited us to stay with her until our child was born, and our plans for the future were arranged. The sad news from the asylum, for which Benjamin had prepared my mind at Paris, reached me soon after our return to England. Miserrimus Dexter's release from the burden of life had come to him by slow degrees. A few hours before he breathed his last, he rallied for a while, and recognized Ariel at his bedside. He feebly pronounced her name, and looked at her, and asked for me. They thought of sending for me, but it was too late. Before the messenger could be dispatched, he said, with a touch of his old self-importance, "Silence, all of you! My brains are weary. I am going to sleep." He closed his eyes in slumber, and never awoke again. So for this man, too, the end came mercifully, without grief or pain. So that strange and many-sided life, with its guilt and its misery, its fitful flashes of poetry and humour, its fantastic gaiety, cruelty, and vanity, ran its destined course, and faded out like a dream. Alas for Ariel! She had lived for the Master. What more could she do, now the Master was gone? She could die for him. They had mercifully allowed her to attend the funeral of Miserrimus Dexter, in the hope that the ceremony might avail to convince her of his death. The anticipation was not realized. She still persisted in denying that the Master had left her. They were obliged to restrain the poor creature by force when the coffin was lowered into the grave, and they could only remove her from the cemetery by the same means when the burial service was over. From that time her life alternated for a few weeks between fits of raving delirium and intervals of lethargic repose. At the annual ball given in the asylum, when the strict superintendence of the patients was in some degree relaxed, the alarm was raised a little before midnight that Ariel was missing. The nurse in charge had left her asleep, and had yielded to the temptation of going downstairs to look at the dancing. When the woman returned to her post, Ariel was gone. The presence of strangers, and the confusion incidental to the festival, offered her facilities for escaping which would not have presented themselves at any other time. That night the search for her proved to be useless. The next morning brought with it the last touching and terrible tidings of her. She had strayed back to the burial ground, and she had been found towards sunrise, dead of cold and exposure, on Miserrimus Dexter's grave. Faithful to the last, Ariel had followed the Master. Faithful to the last, Ariel had died on the Master's grave. Having written these sad words, I turn willingly to a less painful theme. Events had separated me from Major Fitz David, after the date of the dinner party which had witnessed my memorable meeting with Lady Clarinda. From that time I heard little or nothing of the Major, and I am ashamed to say I had almost entirely forgotten him, when I was reminded of the modern Don Juan by the amazing appearance of wedding cards, addressed to me at my mother-in-law's house. The Major had settled in life at last, and, more wonderful still, the Major had chosen, as the lawful ruler of his household and himself, the future Queen of Song, the round-eyed, overdressed young lady with a strident soprano voice. We paid our visit of congratulations in due form, and we really did feel for Major Fitz David. The ordeal of marriage had so changed my gay and gallant admirer of former times that I hardly knew him again. He had lost all his pretensions to youth. He had become, hopelessly and undisguisedly, an old man. Standing behind the chair on which his imperious young wife sat enthroned, he looked at her submissively between every 2 words that he addressed to me, as if he waited for her permission to open his lips and speak. Whenever she interrupted him, and she did it over and over again without ceremony, he submitted with a senile docility and admiration at once absurd and shocking to see.
"Isn't she beautiful?" he said to me in his wife's hearing. "What a figure and what a voice! You remember her voice? It's a loss, my dear lady, an irretrievable loss to the operatic stage. Do you know, when I think what that grand creature might have done, I sometimes ask myself if I really had any right to marry her. I feel, upon my honour, I feel as if I had committed a fraud on the public." As for the favoured object of this quaint mixture of admiration and regret, she was pleased to receive me graciously, as an old friend. While Eustace was talking to the Major, the bride drew me aside out of her hearing, and explained her motives for marrying with a candour which was positively shameless. "You see, we're a large family at home, quite unprovided for," this odious young woman whispered in my ear. "It's all very well about my being a queen of song, and the rest of it. Lord bless you, I've been often enough to the opera, and I've learned enough of my music-master to know what it takes to make a fine singer. I haven't the patience to work at it, as those foreign women do. A parcel of brazen-faced Jezebels. I hate them. No, no, between you and me, it was a great deal easier to get the money by marrying the old gentleman. Here I am, provided for. And there's all my family provided for too, and nothing to do but to spend the money. I'm fond of my family. I'm a good daughter and sister, I am. See how I'm dressed. Look at the furniture. I haven't played my cards badly, have I? It's a great advantage to marry an old man. You can twist him round your little finger. Happy? Oh, yes, I'm quite happy, and I hope you are too. Where are you living now? I shall call soon, and have a long gossip with you. I always had a sort of liking for you, and now I'm as good as you are, I want to be friends." I made a short and civil reply to this, determining inwardly that when she did visit me she should get no further than the house door. I don't scruple to say that I was thoroughly disgusted with her. When a woman sells herself to a man, that vile bargain is none the less infamous to my mind because it happens to be made under the sanction of the Church and the law. As I sit at the desk thinking, my picture of the Major and his wife vanishes from my memory, and the last scene in my story comes slowly into view. The place is my bedroom. The persons, both, if you will be pleased to excuse them, in bed, are myself and my son. He is already 3 weeks old, and he is now lying fast asleep by his mother's side. My good Uncle Starkweather is coming to London to baptize him. Mrs. Macallan will be his godmother, and his godfathers will be Benjamin and Mr. Playmore. I wonder whether my christening will pass off more merrily than my wedding? The doctor has just left the house, in some little perplexity about me. He has found me reclining, as usual, latterly, in my armchair, but on this particular day he has detected symptoms of exhaustion, which he finds quite unaccountable under the circumstances, and which warn him to exert his authority by sending me back to bed. The truth is that I have not taken the doctor into my confidence. There are 2 causes for those signs of exhaustion which have surprised my medical attendant, and the names of them are anxiety and suspense. On this day I have at last summoned courage enough to perform the promise which I made to my husband in Paris. He is informed by this time how his wife's confession was discovered. He knows, on Mr. Playmore's authority, that the letter may be made the means, if he so will it, of publicly vindicating his innocence in a court of law. And, last and most important of all, he is now aware that the confession itself has been kept a sealed secret from him, out of compassionate regard for his own peace of mind, as well as for the memory of the unhappy woman who was once his wife. These necessary disclosures I have communicated to my husband, not by word of mouth. When the time came, I shrank from speaking to him personally of his first wife, but by a written statement of the circumstances, taken mainly out of my letters received in Paris from Benjamin and Mr. Playmore. He has now had ample time to read all that I have written to him, and to reflect on it in the retirement of his own study. I am waiting, with the fatal letter in my hand, and my mother-in-law is waiting in the next room to me, to hear from his own lips whether he decides to break the seal or not. The minutes pass, and we still fail to hear his footsteps on the stairs. My doubts as to which way his decision may turn affect me more and more uneasily the longer I wait. The very possession of the letter, in the present excited state of my nerves, oppresses and revolts me. I shrink from touching it or looking at it. I move it about restlessly from place to place on the bed, and still I cannot keep it out of my mind. At last an odd fancy strikes me. I lift up one of the baby's hands, and put the letter under it, and so associate that dreadful record of sin and misery with something innocent and pretty that seems to hallow and to purify it. The minutes pass, the half-hour longer strikes from the clock on the chimney-piece, and at last I hear him. He knocks softly, and opens the door. He is deadly pale. I fancy I can detect traces of tears on his cheeks. But no outward signs of agitation escape him as he takes his seat by my side. I can see that he has waited until he could control himself, for my sake. He takes my hand and kisses me tenderly. "Valeria," he says, "let me once more ask you to forgive what I said and did in the bygone time. If I understand nothing else, my love, I understand this. The proof of my innocence has been found, and I owe it entirely to the courage and the devotion of my wife." I wait a little to enjoy the full luxury of hearing him say those words, to revel in the love and the gratitude that moisten his dear eyes as they look at me. Then I rouse my resolution, and put the momentous question on which our future depends. "Do you wish to see the letter, Eustace?" Instead of answering directly, he questions me in his turn. "Have you got the letter here?" "Yes." "Sealed up?" "Sealed up." He waits a little, considering what he is going to say next before he says it. "Let me be sure that I know exactly what it is I have to decide," he proceeds. "Suppose I insist on reading the letter." There I interrupt him. I know it is my duty to restrain myself, but I cannot do my duty. "My darling, don't talk of reading the letter. Pray, pray spare yourself." He holds up his hand for silence. "I am not thinking of myself," he says. "I am thinking of my dead wife. If I give up the public vindication of my innocence in my own lifetime, if I leave the seal of the letter unbroken, do you say, as Mr. Playmore says, that I shall be acting mercifully and tenderly toward the memory of my wife?" "Oh, Eustace, there cannot be the shadow of a doubt of it." "Shall I be making some little atonement for any pain that I may have thoughtlessly caused her to suffer in her lifetime?" "Yes, yes." "And, Valeria, shall I please you?" "My darling, you will enchant me." "Where is the letter?" "In your son's hand, Eustace." He goes round to the other side of the bed, and lifts the baby's little pink hand to his lips. For a while he waits so, in sad and secret communion with himself. I see his mother softly open the door, and watch him as I am watching him. In a moment more our suspense is at an end. With a heavy sigh he lays the child's hand back again on the sealed letter, and by that one little action says, as if in words to his son, "I leave it to you." And so it ends. Not as I thought it would end. Not perhaps as you thought it would end. What do we know of our own lives? What do we know of the fulfillment of our dearest wishes? God knows, and that is best. Must I shut up the paper? Yes. There is nothing more for you to read or for me to say. Except this as a postscript. Don't bear hardly, good people, on the follies and the errors of my husband's life. Abuse me as much as you please. But pray think